Good afternoon. I'm Scott Patrick, Executive Director in the Office of Spectrum Management, and we're ready for our exciting afternoon session, which is full of top-line speakers, and in that regard, the price is we're going to have to move quickly to get all these important people back to where they need to be. So I'm going to hand things over to Alan Davidson.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all. It's good to see you. Thank you all for coming back. That's always a good sign. We had a great morning session. For folks who are just joining us, either here in the room or online, I'm Alan Davidson, the Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Administrator of NTIA, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the afternoon session of our 6th annual NTIA Spectrum Symposium. We've got an action-packed program this afternoon, as you've heard, and I am really excited to introduce our next speaker, Arti Prabhakar, who is the Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I will just say quickly, OSTP has been deeply involved in spectrum policy and really a critical White House partner under Arti's leadership. We've been talking, I spoke earlier today about what it took to get this national spectrum strategy across the finish line. And it's true that success has many parents, but clearly one of the parents of this effort was OSTP, and particularly Arti and her team. We simply would not have gotten this strategy done without their support. And I will say we are so lucky to have someone with Arti's background, her background leading DARPA, someone who really understands and has a depth of technical knowledge and understanding of issues surrounding spectrum. So it's been a real pleasure to work with her and her team on everything from, we were doing a panel yesterday on kids' online safety. They're doing a huge amount of work on AI and, of course, leadership on telecom and spectrum issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arti Prabhakar, Director of OSTP, to the stage.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here with you today. I want to thank Alan for that really nice introduction. All credit for OSTP's contributions here go to my wonderful colleague, Austin Bonner, and I know how much she enjoyed working with everyone, because it took everyone to get the progress that we've been able to make on spectrum. Really appreciative of this chance to be here with everyone today and to talk spectrum. I want to do two things. One is simply to foot stomp what you already know and have heard about today, which is how important spectrum is in the Biden-Harris administration and the important actions that have been taken. You all know that the president signed a presidential memorandum just very recently in the fall. It did some really important things. First, it just started by recognizing how important spectrum is for so many of the things that we really count on in this country, our economic competitiveness and our national security. It recognized that it's a scarce resource and that it's been a very contentious issue, and it pulled all kinds of people across government together to get on the same page and be able to start moving forward and making the progress that is so vitally necessary to deal with how we're going to work with spectrum going forward. On the heels of that presidential memorandum was our national spectrum strategy moving out, and there's much more work to be done. We know Congress needs to act to restore FCC's spectrum auction authority, as an example. So we're very much in the midst of this work, but I want to acknowledge how many people across government, but also across the private sector community, had to participate to get to where we are today. So lots more to do there. The second thing I wanted to talk with you all about for a moment is about innovation. And spectrum is the first sentence, I said it too, the first sentence we always say is that spectrum is a scarce resource. And that's true, but as it happens, the entire history of spectrum and of wireless everything is a history of tremendous innovation. And that's really what we're going to need to make progress going forward as well. And it's so fun to reflect on how this capacity to use the electromagnetic waves, how this capacity came about. I have a mom who is 94 years old. She was born in 1930 in a small town in northern India, and she talks about when they got radio and how confused her grandmother was because they used to be able, a song would play and then they could play it over and over again because they had a record player, and her grandmother kept asking, why can't you play that song again? Because they now were hearing it on the radio. And it's so cool to think about this new thing coming into the world. So, I think about Marconi, I think about the early days of radio. Then I think about Hedy Lamarr. Like, how cool is that? This woman who is a bombshell and an actress, and oh, by the way, helped bring frequency hopping into the world. It's just an amazing story to think about. And so, every time we're using Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, we should be thinking about Hedy Lamarr. And then we're at the beginning of Black History Month. I think about Jesse Russell, who was the first graduate of a historically black college or university, the first graduate from an HBCU to be hired at Bell Labs, now many, many years ago, ended up being one of the pioneers of digital cellular. And so every time we use our cell phones, we can think about Jesse Russell and the pioneers who came before. That's how we got to where we are today. And of course, all the spectrum that's been made available, all the technology that makes it possible, we've used it up. And that's why we are in this very constrained environment today. But I think if you now then look forward and think about the innovation that's possible from this point going forward, it's pretty exciting to see what the possibilities still are ahead. Think about everything from better receivers that allow us to be able to operate closer and closer together in spectral bands and still get clear reception. Think about the ability to use AI on the fly in a particular band of spectrum to understand what else is happening in shared spectrum so that we can optimize transmission for all of us. Huge possibilities still ahead there to be operationalized. Think about how we can use analyses and AI in other ways to figure out new ways to allocate spectrum, understanding usage patterns in much richer ways. And think about parts of the spectrum that we haven't fully utilized. The Wild West that happens when you get to higher and higher frequencies. Never mind that we don't fully understand propagation and it's complicated and we don't know how to build the devices. These are things we know we can master. And when we do that, we're going to make the kind of progress. Spectrum will always be scarce, but it does not have to be a zero-sum game. And the reason for that is the innovation that's bubbling and brewing, and that we together, public and private sector working together, that's what we can bring forth into the world to create more and more possibilities in spectrum. I'll just finish my brief remarks by reflecting on the fact that one of the great privileges of working for President Biden, one of the things that he loves to say that I love to repeat, he likes to say that America is a country that can be defined in a single word, and that word is possibilities. And those of us who get to work on science and technology and innovation, we get to bring that to life every single day. And to me, that is the history, but also the future of spectrum and wireless. So thank you for your partnership to get to this point, but also for the future that we're going to create together. And with that, I will turn it back over to Alan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, RT. And right, speaking nerd to this audience, it really works, I can tell. Possibility, that's a good word for us. I'm excited now to introduce our next keynote speaker. As Chief Information Officer at the Department of Defense, the Honorable John Sherman has been, I have to say, a critical partner for us on spectrum issues. John has an enormous portfolio over at DoD, but part of that portfolio includes, one of the largest and most diverse spectrum users on the planet. And he has been extremely valuable as a leader in this space for our work on the National Spectrum Strategy and really broadly for the department and for the country. And I can attest that he is somebody who deeply appreciates that America's national security and economic security are deeply intertwined. I've just been personally very grateful for his partnership and his leadership on these issues and our ability to work together. I think another person without whom this national spectrum strategy would look very, very different. It may not even have been possible. So thank you, John, for your commitment on these often challenging issues that we work on together. And I hope you'll all please join me in welcoming the Defense Department's Chief Information Officer, the Honorable John Sherman.
Good afternoon, and it's an honor to be here with you today. And Alan, thank you for that gracious introduction. I want to echo everything he said about me, about him, about being an amazing partner in what is a very complex space. In the few minutes I have with you, the one thing I want to emphasize up front is we at the Department of Defense absolutely understand that spectrum is critical for this nation. It's critical for our economy, it's critical for commercial success, it's critical for our way of life, and it's also critical for our national defense. And let me start on that just briefly, on the national defense piece of this. We talk a lot about different parts of the spectrum. The mid-band, you hear the lower 3 gigahertz, 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz, which is featured in the National Spectrum Strategy. You turn on the news now, and you see U.S. naval vessels operating in the Red Sea. You hear their names, the USS Carney, the Hudner, the Mason, and others. You either look on social media or you watch the news, and you see at night tongues of flames leaping out of vertical launchers with missiles intercepting Houthi cruise missiles and other projectiles aimed at the Red Sea area. The radars guiding those missiles are emanating in the lower 3 gigahertz band. And when I see, for example, the USS Carney, one of the ships that's been in the middle of this, as recently as last night, by the way, using that spectrum to be able to get their missiles and ordnance to protect that commercial shipping and to protect our service members, this is what we're talking about with spectrum. And it's not only for naval radars, it's for ground-based radars, it's for air radars. And so we need to be able to protect this country using that spectrum while also balancing with the commercial needs. And so that's very critical. And so we talk about the strategies and the way ahead. So last fall, we completed the Emerging Mid-Band Radar Spectrum Sharing Study. That's a mouthful, or EMBERS, as some of you may know it as. Ms. Vernita Harris, who's over in the anteroom over there, our spectrum lead, dutifully completed this in compliance with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Delivered it to the Commerce Department through Secretary Austin, delivered it to Secretary Raimondo. Now, much in that study, undergirding where the National Spectrum Strategy is going on this. And one of the big areas that we're excited to work on with Alan and his team is co-leading a future study that'll be articulated in the implementation plan looking at the lower 3 gigahertz, the 3.1 to 3.45. As we are full co-leaders on this, left seat, right seat, working together with our NTIA partners because of the dual commercial and military needs of that part of the spectrum. We're going to be looking at something called dynamic spectrum sharing, DSS. You hear the term moonshot in there, which I love that word, because this nation, when we put our heads to it, between industry and government and academia, we can get things done. We have to figure DSS out, not only for the lower 3 gigahertz, but indeed, if and when we get this right, it unlocks other parts of the spectrum as well. And this is something, I would add, that even other nations have not mastered, to include authoritarian competitors, like the People's Republic of China. We get this right, we unlock some spectrum. So we're looking forward to working on this. It'll be a moonshot. We are going to work closely with NTIA. We need industry help. We need academia's help. We need to think about how we do this at a nationwide scale, building on what we've done with citizen broadband radio service, building on what we've done elsewhere, making it cyber secure, making it AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, machine driven, not with the person with their hand on it, but in a way that can ensure potential commercial viability and the military viability of this. Because in addition to operating overseas in the Red Sea and supporting our Ukrainian allies and other contingency operations, our service members train here in the United States every single day, whether it's down in Norfolk, whether it's at Fort Cavazos in my home state of Texas, whether it's at Edwards Air Force Base, and so on. I can go all around the nation here. The women and men in our military are training every day to keep us safe using those radars. But there's ways we can work together with NTI and others to try, as my friend Alan says, the lower 3 gigahertz is too important to not be able to use. We've got to be able to unlock this. So we're going to work together on this. And there's one thing I do want to emphasize from the DoD area. Not only are we interested in this for the radars, we're 5G users too. As we look at 5G telecommunications, another area under the portfolio that I oversee, in addition to all the other stuff, I work in cybersecurity, cloud, and everything else, is 5G. And that recently came over to me from our research and engineering portfolio. And as many of you have probably seen, we have a number of 5G pilots around this nation right now at various military bases. We have 3 lines of effort we're looking at. One is on-base communications. We use the term morale, welfare, and recreation, which I think actually undersells how important this is. It is a modern utility our service members and civilians need on base. And we're committed to having 5G on every U.S. military installation, continental United States and overseas by the end of 2028. Our second line of effort are kind of these bespoke mission needs, such as smart warehouses, maintenance, healthcare, and we're running pilots all around different military bases on this. And thirdly, what we call field usage, tactical networks for communications in the field as well as for autonomous vehicles. This is very important. And throughout, Open Radio Access Network, or ORAN technology, will be paramount, not only in the pilots, but as we roll this out. So with that in mind, we have our military usage, we have our National Spectrum Strategy partnership that on the study we're going to co-lead. We are, as the implementation plan comes out, with our NTIA partners, looking at dynamic spectrum sharing, and where the sharing we looked at in the Ember study, we're also going to look at some other aspects. Potentially some limited paid-for relocation, perhaps for future airborne radars. We didn't look at that in the Ember study. But we're going to check this out here and really try to turn over every rock we can on this, because we know the criticality, as some of the previous speakers I understand said today, about the very close unity of commercial and military success. And I'll end on this. When Alan and I have frequent chances to go up to the Hill together, what I'm about to tell you is what I always lead off with. We are in the same line of business. We work in different buildings, both pretty retro buildings, by the way. We handle, our titles are a little bit differently, but we're in the same line of business, that we win. The United States wins. We must win economically. We must be strong militarily to protect this nation, and we're in the same line of business. And with that, I thank you for your support. I look forward to working with Alan and his team going forward as the National Spectrum Strategy moves forward, and I thank you for your support. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. And I have to say, I will echo what he said. We really are in the same line of work, and that is America's success. And so I think you heard it here, and we'll say it again. America's economic security and national security go hand in hand when we think about spectrum policy. And I really could not have asked for a much better partner than John Sherman, and I think you just got a chance to hear why. And I will just kind of foot stomp some of the things that he said, about where we're headed next with some of these big studies. We've done, I just give them so much credit for doing an exhaustive study in this lower 3 gigahertz area, and we're gearing up to communicate the results of that study officially, as we've been asked to do. But as he mentioned, our belief is this is too important a band to give up on, and we've got some follow-on work to do there. So with that, I am really delighted to introduce our final keynote speaker today of the afternoon before we move into our panels, and that is Chairwoman Kathy McMorris-Rodgers of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And I have to say, a couple things I could say about the Chairwoman. First of all, I can personally attest that she can run a tough oversight hearing. We've gotten into some things, but I have, and our team at NTIA have, enormous respect for her leadership and her principled approach to the big issues in front of us, from privacy to broadband and spectrum especially. And the chairwoman has made spectrum issues a major focus of the committee's work. She's demonstrated a steadfast commitment to making sure that America maintains its leadership in wireless technology. She's been a champion of innovation in spectrum policy. The committee's moved legislation in this regard. She's been also, I will say, I'm grateful for her continuing to promote NTIA's leadership role in this space and modernizing NTIA's existing statutory authority to ensure that we're well positioned to address the challenges that we face now and in the future. And we're grateful for her leadership and her support. So I'm so glad to be here today to be able to introduce her today to all of you, Chairwoman Kathy McMorris-Rogers of the House Energy and Commerce Committee.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Davidson. I appreciate your leadership, and it's been good working together with you since I became the chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. It's a great committee, ton of issues, but this issue around spectrum is so important, and so I appreciate the chance to be able to help welcome you all here today, and I appreciate the invitation to be able to address you. The work that you do to connect Americans and secure technological leadership is truly a public service. Access to communication services has become vital, as you all can attest to even more than me. Everything from accessing healthcare and education services to growing a small business, participating in today's economy. And by utilizing next generation technologies, the U.S. is leading to help get internet services to Americans faster and more reliable than ever. Making spectrum available for commercial use is essential to maintain American leadership in next generation wireless technology. And we share that goal. In November, NTIA released the National Spectrum Strategy. This strategy identifies spectrum bands to be studied to determine what will be made available for commercial use. It also affirms NTIA's role as the manager of spectrum, federal government's spectrum. And one of the spectrum bands highlighted for study in the strategy stands out from the others, and that's the lower 3 gigahertz band. And this will be the second time, I know you've already heard, but the second time that we have in 2 years that the federal government is studying this band. This time, however, the study will be led by NTIA, the expert agency on spectrum within the executive branch. And I believe that's where it should have been from the start. For America to continue its wireless leadership, we must make sure that spectrum resources are used as efficiently as possible, and that we must continue to make sure that spectrum is available for commercial use in a way that's going to best serve the American people. Spectrum is one of the most important and valuable resources, impacting everything from our military radar capabilities to mobile broadband and GPS systems for Americans that they rely on every day. So we really do need to have a thoughtful approach as we make these decisions around spectrum policy. And it definitely means that we need to be working together, that our federal users, the very critical spectrum that's used in protecting Americans is protected, but also making sure that spectrum resources are used efficiently. The National Spectrum Policy Strategy is a good first step, and we need to make sure that we make those studies available and identify the opportunities for commercial use as we're doing this. Spectrum availability to the commercial sector is key to economic security and national security. It's a key part of our shared goals. There needs to be certainty about what spectrum will be auctioned and when. In order to do this, we need to get on the same page. So I'm going to be continuing to work with my colleagues in the House and the Senate and with NTIA to establish a strong, sustainable spectrum policy that benefits Americans and advance our interest. A sustainable spectrum policy is vital to securing our competitive edge. China and other countries, but especially China, have made significant amounts of spectrum available for commercial use, which is giving them an advantage when it comes to next generation wireless leadership. They've also amassed a significant share of global communications equipment industry and are leveraging that to dominate and flood the market, including in the United States, with cheaper and less secure alternatives. Relying on this technology comes with a very significant risk. It could be used by the CCP to surveil Americans, steal personal information, and even shut down entire networks. Homes, schools, hospitals, our financial system, and the military are all in jeopardy as long as this equipment remains part of our communications infrastructure. The U.S. needs trusted alternatives to remain competitive with companies like Huawei and ZTE. That's why I'm paying very close attention to NTIA's administration of the Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund, which seeks to advance the development and adoption of open and interoperable radio access networks, or ORAN, by injecting funding into an industry working to diversify the telecom supply chain. This program can help promote vendor diversity, which creates a market that will be affordable and a trusted alternative to equipment produced by Huawei and ZTE. It is critical for our national security that we work together to achieve the goals initially set by Congress and eliminate equipment that compromises our networks. We also must fund the shortfall in the Rip and Replace program. I see some heads nodding. Wireless technology is only as good as the networks it relies on, and it is critically important to national security. We must be working together to maintain the U.S.'s reputation as the #1 place for businesses to invest in innovation and grow the economy and to continue to create opportunities. Part of this is coming together on a unified approach to spectrum policy. So I sincerely appreciate all of you being here and your support and your input on all of these issues. Thank you for the invitation to participate today. Thank you for all you're doing, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on these shared goals. Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Rogers, for taking the time out of your schedule and joining us today. Appreciate everything you do for us and our country and keeping our country a global leader in wireless telecommunications. All right, well, we're going to change gears a little bit. I want to introduce our next panel. It's going to focus on the third pillar of the National Spectrum Strategy. This panel is going to be talking about leveraging technology to create innovative tools for spectrum management. As spectrum needs grow, the strategy calls on us to promote innovative technologies and to expand access to spectrum. The strategy further calls for an effort that you've heard mentioned already to advance research and create incentives. Our moderator will be Dr. Paul Ransom, Technology Advisor in OSM's Strategic Planning Division, and he's assembled a great panel of technologists and research experts from the government, industry, and academia. So I turn it over now to Paul to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Scott. I'll give her a pound. Good afternoon, and welcome to this. As Scott said, this is the third panel on the National Spectrum Strategy, Pillar 3 of the National Spectrum Strategy, entitled Unprecedented Spectrum Innovation, Access, and Management Through Technology Development. We do have an esteemed panel of 5 technical experts who will be here to share their insights and expertise on the crucial role technology plays in maximizing spectrum access through innovation and the benefit of increased focused on the development of dynamic spectrum sharing technologies. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce my panel. To my immediate left is Dr. John Chapin. He is a special advisor for Spectrum at the National Science Foundation. He leads research programs, chairs the Foundation's Spectrum Innovation Initiative, advises NSF on spectrum strategy, and on behalf of NSF, serves as the co-chair of the White House-sponsored interagency working group, the Wireless and Spectrum Research and Development. To his immediate left is Dr. Andrew Clegg. Andy is a spectrum engineering lead at Google and one of the principal architects of the Citizens Broadband Radio Service. Andy is also representing the Wireless Innovation Forum and holds the position of Chief Technology Officer for the group. Overall, Andy has over 30 years of experience in wireless spectrum topics. To the left of Andy is Dr. Charles Dietland. Charles is a program manager at the research group, program manager and research group leader in the theory division of the National Technology and Information Administration's Institute for Telecommunication Sciences. Charles's research focuses on interference analysis, very important, interference protection criteria, so indeed very important. Before joining ITS, he served several roles in the Department of Defense, leading programs in RF sensing and electronic warfare. Next to Dr. Dietland is Dr. Monisha Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Notre Dame and a member of Notre Dame's Wireless Institute. She is also the policy outreach director for Spectrum X, the National Science Foundation's first Center for Spectrum Innovation. Prior to joining the University of Notre Dame in 2022, Dr. Ghosh was the Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Communications Commission, a program director at the National Science Foundation, research professor at University of Chicago, and spent 24 years in industry research at Bell Labs, Philips Research, InterDigital, working on a wide variety of wireless systems with an emphasis on spectrum sharing. Finally, next to Dr. Ghosh is Dr. Brian Kelly. Dr. Kelly is also an associate professor at the Electrical and Computer Engineering and Advanced Communication at the Klesse College of Engineering at the University of Texas at San Antonio. In 2023, Dr. Kelly was named Principal Investigator in the Future G Applied Research at the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense and Research Engineering for the Department of Defense. Dr. Kelly has over 70 referee publications and holds 11 patents and spent more than 10 years in the telecommunications industry with Motorola. Unfortunately, we couldn't get a more credentialed group of panelists, so I guess we'll just have to go with the guys we have here. Certainly, before we get started, I did want to warn everybody, we're probably going to nerd out a little bit, so for those that are in the audience, maybe you could bear with us. But with that said, let's get started. The National Spectrum Strategy proposes an effort to significantly advance dynamic spectrum sharing within 12 to 18 months. Specifically, it calls for an effort in collaboration with industry to advance research, create investment incentives, and set forth measurable goals for advancing the state of technology for spectrum access, with this emphasis on dynamic spectrum sharing. This is initially a question to all panelists, but I'll ask John to get us started. Given the ambitious timeline and the administration's desire to make meaningful and measurable progress to advance dynamic spectrum sharing, what, in your view, should a dynamic spectrum sharing effort accomplish and achieve at the end of this 18-month period?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Paul, and thank you for all the work that you and the NTIA team have done to get us to this point, definitely. Well, to meaningfully advance dynamic spectrum sharing, the DSS pilot should do an experiment whose outcome will influence an important near-future decision and going in a direction that creates investment incentives for deploying new spectrum sharing approaches. The important near-term decisions that the DSS pilot could influence are clearly the 3 gigahertz and 7 gigahertz band studies called for in the National Spectrum Strategy. So the plan for one or the other of these band studies should be co-designed with the plan for the DSS pilot so that data from the pilot experiment is useful for the study and arrives at a time when the data can still have a significant impact on the decisions about repurposing or sharing. The pilot experiment itself should be designed to meet several goals. It's critical that the approach or approaches tested in the pilot experiment are plausible and viable for use in the target band. Given the short time frame and high stakes, the approaches tested must be relatively mature so they can be implemented in the experimental systems quickly with low technical risk. Finally, the pilot should be an experiment done at scale in the field, right? We have plenty of paper and pencil models and laboratory experimental results, which all sides roundly disregard, right, when there's a disagreement. We need trustworthy, hard data at scale, which will become ground truth rather than a debatable assumption. To get there, the DSS pilot experiment needs two things. It needs the active participation of the key existing and prospective users of the band, and it needs the participation of a neutral third party, one that is expert in measuring spectrum and in assessing system performance to oversee the data collection and analysis. The highest leverage experiments would be ones that focus on aggregate effects at scale. Those are questions that nobody has good data about today. So I'm going to give a couple of examples here. They're just notional examples, but these are 3 examples of experimental data that might be highly impactful in the band studies. One, looking at the aggregate interference of a large-scale 5G network to a particular site or in a particular direction. How much can that aggregate interference be reduced through real-time operator control of network parameters? When adapting the network parameters for this purpose, what's the trade-off curve between reducing aggregate 5G interference and loss of 5G network performance? Here's a second experiment we could consider doing. Can an evolved spectrum access system, or a SAS, predict aggregate interference from a large-scale 5G network or Wi-Fi deployment accurately enough and fast enough to protect incumbent users in real time as things change? And when a SAS would be tasked to provide that real-time protection, what is the trade-off curve between the amount of information shared by the network operator or the Wi-Fi deployment users, the amount of information shared by the protected users, and the accuracy of that SAS prediction? Here's a third experiment. Can an affordable add-on or upgrade to the receiver of a legacy fixed microwave link digitally cancel the aggregate interference from a diverse Wi-Fi build-out or a large-scale 5G network? And how many nines of reliability does the cancellation actually achieve in real-world conditions, right? So a DSS pilot experiment that generates trustworthy data on questions like these would help the band study process adopt forward-leaning solutions that enhance spectrum access for all users. And that would be a meaningful and impactful way to realize the vision articulated in the National Spectrum Strategy.
Thanks, John. I think that was an excellent delineation of all the things that would be critical in order for us to have measurable, meaningful progress in order to really move forward the advancement of spectrum sharing and obviously spectrum access. I wonder if our panelists, if any other panelists want to kind of take on this question as well. Sure, thanks, Andy.
So I don't want to be a naysayer, but I don't think we're going to make any significant progress in 12 to 18 months in actual technologies for spectrum sharing. John laid out a fantastic list of things that we should look at. It's many of the things I would have also said, but he also laid out probably a 5 to 10 year research program that would be required to resolve those. We're in our 4th year of actual CBRS experience, and we're still dealing with some of those. Aggregate interference is a big thing. It's a big challenge to deal with. So, I would think in 12 to 18 months, I think we can set goals along the lines of, some of the things John laid out and maybe some others. But I don't anticipate that we will actually have tangible results in 12 to 18 months. So, I think setting goals is good. But, to just emphasize John's list, I'd say if you're looking at key areas based upon our experience in CBRS, number 1 would be propagation. Propagation models are critical, and getting ones that are more realistic and take clutter into account, very important. Number 2 is how to deal with aggregate interference, as John mentioned. And then number 3 is propagation again. So.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you, Monisha.
Just a few comments to add on to what's already been said. I think in the morning panels, we heard a lot of discussion about evidence-based and unbiased and measurements. And I think putting that in the context of what John just mentioned is hard because the sharing is happening with another entity. And so we can do all of this on the 5G side or on the commercial wireless side, but the input on is this interfering has to come from the incumbent. And unless we have a process by which we can have this two-way exchange of information, it's going to be very hard to make progress. Going back to the 12 to 18 month, I agree it's a really tough schedule to meet for meaningful outcomes, but we can definitely get started. And in addition to the experiments that John described, we have to have simulations and modeling because no matter how much we test, how much we experiment, we are not going to be able to cover all of the probabilistic events that can lead to interference. And to that end, actually, some of the efforts that are happening in academia within Spectrum X, in collaboration with NTIA, where we are starting to look at what does a 5G base station, what does the interference profile in 3D look like probabilistically. We want to move away from worst case interference modeling and develop simulations and models that are more probabilistic. We're doing similar things with 6 gigahertz, where we are going out there, taking measurements on deployed systems and understanding what the real world effect of these are. So, in addition to, doing new experiments, we can look back at the systems that are already developed. So 6 is very similar to 7, as was pointed out before. We have a lot of 5G deployed in 3.7 gigahertz. We have CBRS deployed in 3.55 to 3.7. What are the lessons we can learn from propagation and interference without setting up a separate experiment? Can we just leverage these deployments themselves and learn something from them?
Charles, would you like to say something?
Sure. So I'm from 18 months in the future, and I've got to write this report that quantifies this advancement in DSS. So I think, and this raises a lot of questions, what are the metrics? How do we define baseline performance? What is the specific advancement that we're looking to quantify? And how do we get the data from those systems, like Manisha just said, so that we can turn that into metrics that do demonstrate this? Otherwise, we can do an experiment, any one of those three, and not have something that really documents how successful the advancement was. And we need more than one metric. I'm thinking about CBRS, like Andy pointed out. We had one figure of merit in the report that we wrote last year on the growth of CBRS. It was just emitter count, essentially. And so we need more than that, and we need to be thinking creatively about what those are at the beginning of designing this demonstration.
Thank you, Charles. Brian, would you like?
So when we talk about CBRS, so CBRS is Citizen Broadband Radio Service, and it's really a subset of 5G. And so I think a lot of the things that we're discussing fall along the lines of some of the standards, the international standards for the 3GPP. There's also the International Telecommunications Union and the North American version of 3GPP, which is ANIS. It might be helpful to integrate partners along these lines so that it's not just sort of internal U.S. entities speaking to other internal U.S. entities. It's U.S. entities collaborating internationally in order to form a holistic solution that can be adopted. So one of the possible solutions to really get our hands around this might be to integrate a standards body as part of the effort so that we can present the results, potentially get the results into the standard. And that makes it a longer-term solution. It's not just a U.S.-only solution.
I think that's an excellent point to make. In order for things to really be actionable and actually be implementable, you actually think about the standards, and perhaps having them play a role, at least being a part of it, could be helpful. We talked a lot, and I think John laid out, like Andy said, really a long-term vision for perhaps what a DSS kind of initiative would be. And we heard the Honorable Mr. Sherman talk about a dynamic spectrum sharing, effort that would provide something meaningful in 12 to 18 months. And when I think about, what would be the key factors for success, I think John talked about it. The idea that, it has to be relevant. It has to provide some information that is actionable for these studies. And, the relevancy of that would be, where are we going to look at? What band would you, kind of look at to conduct a particular, effort or a study? Or, I'm sorry, effort or an effort. Are there other key factors for success of that kind of a kind of effort like that, this pilot that we haven't identified, or are those what John described here? Because at the end, you don't want it to be a paper report that goes on the shelf. You want to have effectively something that really informs momentum for dynamic spectrum sharing technology. Are there other key factors for success that maybe we haven't identified, or has John kind of laid those out? Okay, go ahead, Manisha.
Yeah, I think it is really, really key that, and this has been discussed many times today already, is the transparency and cooperation. It cannot, all these experiments we're talking about cannot be one-sided, because otherwise we're never going to make progress. So, and that is a challenge. I think that's a challenge that I think it's for the NTIA to solve, is to how do you get the incumbents in any band that's going to be shared. And 7 to 8 is not just one incumbent. There are multiple incumbents in that band in various parts of it. How do we get them all to the table? And that, I think, will be critical for any of these experiments to be successful.
Thank you, Manisha. Anyone?
Yeah, so within the Department of Defense, there have been a number of efforts on end-to-end system configurations, and we have a lot of experimental data and studies along these lines, because one of the things that is concerning, obviously, for DoD is the fact that a lot of our prior systems were not designed to be coexistent. They were not designed to support other spectrum outside of their own. So we have efforts going on and studies that we've pursued on coexistent systems using shared spectrum. And so another possibility would be to partner with the Department of Defense in some of the efforts that we have pursued, and not to start from like ground zero and try to develop wholly new approaches.
Thank you. Let's continue, I think, with this shared spectrum topic. Perhaps this might be a question for Brian or Andy or Monisha. How can we address concerns about harmful interference, security, and trust between users as we move forward? Brian talked about partnering. What are some of your ideas for, developing the trust that's going to be needed to implement, dynamic sharing topics or solutions? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
So in the CBRS case, the way the government dealt with harmful interference was to so severely restrict CBRS deployments that there wasn't a chance that we would cause interference. We used incredibly conservative propagation models, incredibly conservative standoff distances, incredibly conservative constraints on CBRS to ensure that there would never be a photon of interference. After 4 years, what we've learned is that there has never been a photon of interference to the DoD from CBRS that I'm aware of. The DoD has never contacted SAS administrators and said that they are getting any interference. Now, you could argue maybe if they were getting interference, they wouldn't let us know for some reason, but I suspect they probably would have let us know. So, in a way, that is a way of building trust, is start very conservative and then sort of back off from that conservatism as you gain experience. And in fact, that's what's now happening. NTIA and DoD have been incredibly helpful working with the SAS community and the CBRS community to look at tweaking some of those constraints that CBRS is working under, relaxing them, recognizing that there hasn't been an interference problem, and so therefore CBRS is probably too protective of the incumbent. And so we've been working in, again, a great model where we meet every 2 weeks with NTIA and FCC and DoD and NIST and ITS and others, and we work on sort of backing off some of those conservative assumptions. And we're about to, implement some new CBRS constraints that are much less strict than they used to be, and it'll result in a lot less fewer times where CBRS will have to close down in areas and coastal areas and things like that. It'll make a big difference to the CBRS users while we're still fully protecting the incumbent. If interference happens to occur, we'll sort of back up and we'll go to more conservative things. But I think that's one way to deal with it, is maybe start off conservative and then back off. I've also argued sort of the opposite, that if you start off conservative and back off, then you never really know, or if you start off conservative, period, you never really know how far off the interference criteria you are. You just know you don't cause interference. You don't know if you're 1 dB below interference threshold or you're 20 dB or whatever. You don't know how much margin you have there. So in some ways, and I argued this in the paths process, let's look at it differently. Let's invert it. Let's have liberal assumptions, and then if interference occurs, we have a way of dealing with it immediately, stop buzzer kind of thing, but at least that gives you some idea of how far above the interference threshold you are, and then you work backwards and work back down. So I think either of those two processes, obviously from the commercial point of view, starting out less restrictive and then backing off if you need to is the preferred way to go. But in the case of CBRS, we started off very restrictive, and then we're gradually easing some of the restrictions.
Manisha?
Yeah, so in the previous panel, a statement was made that we need to get the physical layer radio engineers in the room to discuss interference. I was really happy to hear that because that's my background. So I think we really have to ask ourselves, what is interference and what is harmful interference? So most of the time we are given an RF threshold. It's minus 6 dB of interference power is harmful interference. That does not take into account what that system performance is. Most systems today are digital. They have very sharp waterfall curves of performance. And yes, if you are already at your threshold, if you have no margin left, that interference can tip you into harmful interference. But if you're operating in a 30 dB link fade margin region, you will have interference, but it's not harmful interference. So again, really understanding what these two coexistence systems are like, what is it that actually will make one of the systems to tip into the harmful interference range is critical. And we don't really understand that very well for a lot of the systems we are sharing with. So when you design, if you look at Wi-Fi, which natively shares with each other, you know exactly what the system properties are of another Wi-Fi device, and you design your back-off and your sensing thresholds appropriately. When we are designing with a 6 gigahertz fixed link, for example, we are working against an RF threshold. We are not really looking at what does the bit error rate performance of that system look like, and how far can we push the coexistence to, obviously don't want to operate at the edge of harmful interference, but what is a reasonable buffer to give to any system so that it can tolerate some interference but not become the unreliable. And those are really where the trust issue comes in, how much of the incumbent system, how much, in the federal case, it's really hard to share those kind of system level details, what is your SNR of performance. But even if we get anything better than what we are today in terms of just looking at RF levels, we'd be in a much better place.
Thank you, Manisha. Real quick, before Brian, I know you want to say something. So we heard from Andy, essentially collaboration, working together has built trust within the CBRS community. Manisha talked about getting people in the room and getting a look at the systems as much as you can to learn better. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so there are many different ways to enable coexistence. And one of the challenges is the communities are not always sort of communicating with each other. If you look at, as an example, radar systems versus telecommunication systems, they talk different languages. And one has to understand, both systems in order to enable coexistence. There are also issues with trust, and trust not only in terms of do you trust the interference levels, but security-based trust issues. And NIST has proposed something called zero trust for telecommunications. I think in this case, zero trust would also work well when we're dealing with interactions between very critical infrastructure-based systems that need to coexist. And we need to integrate that as well to ensure malicious actors don't sort of feed into the network and create havoc.
Thank you. So as it relates to dynamic spectrum sharing, we say if we're going to implement that kind of technology, those types of solutions, we need to collaborate. We need to, work together sooner. We need to understand each other's systems, and that will enable better trust. That will enable better implementation, maybe quicker implementation. That will address concerns. Are there any other ways in which we can, better understand harmful interference, or at least be able to be on the same page when it comes to harmful interference and more quickly implement dynamic spectrum sharing solutions? Is there anything else out there that we should be considering or that we think might address concerns? Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say the real world is its own best model. And one thing that's sort of an underlying assumption is, when risk is high, trust has to be very high. But the converse is true. If you can push risk down, then trust doesn't have to be so high before you start. And one thing that drives a very high perception of risk is the perception that if we start down a certain path with a certain set of rules, we're going to be stuck with that for 10 or 20 or 50 years. But last year at ISART, we were all talking about iterative regulatory improvement. I forget what the exact phrase was. But let's say that the auctions for licensed access in these new shared bands was for 3 months of access. And then after 3 months, we maybe tweak the rules a bit, and you say, well, what's the return on investment for the next 3 months? And you would bid appropriately for the next 3 months. Meanwhile, the folks on the other side could have some confidence that if the rules weren't working to their needs, then after 3 months it would get fixed. I'm not saying that's the right policy solution, but I'm saying that there is a dimension of shrinking the amount of time that we commit to things that shrinks the perceived risks on all parts and thereby makes it easier to get to the required level of trust.
Dynamic rules around the dynamic spectrum sharing.
Excellent. Charles?
Sure. I was just going to jump back to the harmful interference for a second and say that although I'm part of the government that Andy pointed out created the conservative thresholds, I agree with Andy and Manisha that in general these thresholds are very conservative. I think on a really technically in the weeds level, we really need to revive curiosity about interference protection criteria. And standards of practice and measurements and modeling and simulation. IPC is dependent on signal type, channel conditions, signal processing settings, target type, et cetera. And it's so nuanced and complex that we end up looking for something simple to talk about, such as our classic -6 dB interference to noise ratio for radars, where we really know that it's more complex in the vast majority of cases than that, and that's a very conservative threshold that we've agreed on. So we have the ability to be better and finer grained in defining these things. It just requires more complexity in the dynamic spectrum sharing system, but I think we need to go in that direction.
Thanks, Charles. Go ahead, Andy.
Sorry, but just going back to the dynamic rules comment, I think that's going to be difficult for a long time because we have the required APA process that rules and rule changes have to go through, and that just takes a very long amount of time. So I mean, unless the APA is changed, it's unlikely that we can have a dynamic rules process where the rules can be changed on months kind of timescale. But what we're taking advantage of in the CBRS world is that the CBRS rules are not completely prescriptive. Some of it was left to standards in order to implement, and you can change standards faster than you can change FCC rules. And so we're able to go back and change the standards to reflect some of the new work that the Navy and NTIA and the DoD at large is doing. And I think that's helping the process. So I wouldn't say at this point we could count on dynamic rules unless there's a big legislative change to the Administrative Procedure Act. But I think if you let the rules be more general and allow industry to sort of codify all of the actual details in standards, that might be one way to deal with it.
Brian?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is really looking at, what are the goals? And part of the difficulty, companies trying to define all the details of what's supposed to happen along with those goals. So I think as long as the results are more goal-based, solutions using machine learning and artificial intelligence can look below the surface and figure out what are the best trade-offs between, if it's policies or objective functions or interference or whatever that mixture is. I think as long as we can define the goals, it's very easy below the surface to figure out, okay, these tweaks of policy will generate certain results.
That was really going to be my next question about the role that perhaps artificial intelligence or machine learning could play in addressing those concerns and being able to kind of turn those knobs. Are there any other ideas about, what a role that AI and ML could play in enhancing dynamic spectrum sharing? Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, so, one of the most important things when you're developing an AI or ML model is that you've got to have really good training data. That's really what it's all about. And in the case of, if you go back to CBRS, some really good training data on coexistence among wireless systems is what's happening in the GAA tier. The GAA tier is the sort of lightly licensed tier of CBRS, and a spectrum access system has no authority under the CBRS rules to limit GAA use. As long as a priority access license isn't using the spectrum or an incumbent isn't using the spectrum, every GAA has the ability to use every available piece of spectrum in CBRS. And so what we found early on is that, so for example, if you're a GAA operator and you're on one side of the street and you ask the SAS what spectrum is available, and the SAS is going to say, okay, this 80 megahertz is available, we got all 8 channels available, then a GAA across the street from that one the next day asks for what spectrum is available, and the SAS will give the exact same response. The same 8 channels are available, even though they're right across the street from each other. We have to say all of those channels are available. They're just the GAA pool, and any GAA can use them. Those 2 GAAs then have to pretty much work out on their own how they're going to coexist, and sometimes they'll split 40-40, or they'll find some way to deal with it, or sometimes they don't find a way to deal with it, and then they're yelling at their SASs, and everything, and we've had to get in the middle of it. But the training data that results from this is that in the history of when we give GAA assignments in the CBRS band, we give them all of that spectrum, and then over time, the GAA users sort of self-organize so that they're able to use the spectrum in what is probably, if not the most efficient way, obviously an efficient way. And if we go back and we pull how the GAA actual spectrum use evolves after we give them spectrum grants, that could make a very valuable training set in determining the best way to deal with, equal tier coexistence. So, it's like one of the things on my list. Can we go back and look at all of this GAA assignment and actual use data that the SASs have access to, and use that as a training algorithm for how same tier systems can coexist?
Sure, Monisha, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing up GAA coexistence, Andy, because that is something that we've actually done a fair amount of work to on the ground. And actually, in real life, many times there's not very good coexistence mechanisms in place. And the other big thing, which is something which I would really recommend, that no matter what NTIA ends up doing with 3 gigahertz, is it's harmonized with what's happening in the band. The other big problem with CBRS is because CBRS was done as a medium to low power allocation before C-band and Embrace came up on both sides. Now you have a situation where you have a huge power imbalance at the band edges. So now you're having this coexistence issue not only with systems in your band, but systems in adjacent band. So when we talk about coexistence and dynamic spectrum sharing, we also have to be very careful on what is happening today in adjacent bands and what's going to happen in the future in adjacent bands. And this is actually even more serious when you're talking about repurposing bands that are adjacent to passive bands like weather satellites and other systems. Going back to the GAA coexistence for a minute and just extending that thought a little bit more, and I think Brian brought up the point about standards. The truth of the matter is 5G as designed today is not built to operate in shared spectrum. So all of these problems that we are seeing with GA coexistence is because you've taken a system that's natively designed to be deployed in exclusively licensed spectrum and just plunked it into a shared spectrum environment. So there has to be a joint the standards need to change too. And so in the conversations that are happening with 6G or 5G advanced, there has to come the realization that most likely future spectrum that's available for 6G will have to be shared. So in addition to having, say, a third-party database that is adjudicating sharing of spectrum, the systems themselves on both sides, the incumbent systems as well as the commercial systems that want to come in, have to be designed differently. So on the federal side, if you're designing a radar today that's going to be deployed in 10 years, are you going to design it the way you've designed that radar 10 years before when you had exclusive spectrum, or are you going to try and put in some hooks that will allow it to operate in a contested environment? So those are some of the longer term things when we think about dynamic spectrum sharing, is that the systems have to be designed differently.
Sure, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, can I add to that? So within the 3GPP and the 5G standards, ORAN has made a huge impact. And one of the great things about the Open Radio Access Network Alliance is that the architecture has software-based, what are called XApps and RApps, that enable software-driven, potentially machine learning solutions to occur. So it's not just sort of the use of AI and ML, it's do you have interoperable capabilities so that systems can know what the other system is doing, the issues with latency and delay and assumptions about interfaces to enable coexistence are really important. So I think a solution based on ORAN and open standards also is extremely important.
Thank you. Really fascinating discussion on spectrum sharing. I'm really enjoying this. Perhaps we might want to pivot a little bit. I think John said something earlier. Real world might be one of the best ways to build trust. In the National Spectrum Strategy, there is a proposal, if you will, for a national spectrum test bed. It too would be, developed within this 12 to 18 month time frame. I wonder if our panelists can talk to us about what are the key design principles to ensure this national test bed has long-term value, not just over the upcoming months, but certainly long-term value and accessibility to a diverse group of stakeholders. I wonder if our panel might want to talk about those key design principles for us. Sure, go ahead, Monisha.
So SpectrumX submitted detailed comments to the NSS Implementation Plan, and in that we outlined a different way of looking at testbeds. So a lot of us who worked in government and industry and academia have dealt with testbeds in the past, and most often they have not been very successful in making changes because these test beds take a lot of time to set up. They're very narrow in what they set out to do. They can never really test sharing in every different kind of environment you actually want to throw at it, the real world. And so we came up with a different concept of what a test environment could be. Is perhaps NTIA and FCC and the incumbents could come up with a framework where it is much easier for people who want to use the spectrum to get experimental licenses. So you have a piece of equipment, and you think it can be used in a certain region without interference. Get the experimental, that becomes the test bed. So it's not a test bed in a certain place with certain equipment and with only certain features, but it really opens up the idea of being able to create test environments wherever people think that that spectrum could be shared. Of course, it's not that easy to do because you have to have, the stop clock, which says that interference is occurring. You have to stop your experiment right now, and all of those mechanisms have to be put in place. But going by the philosophy that the real world is your best environment to experimenters, I would encourage NTIA to think about how we can implement something along those lines.
Oh, go ahead, John. No, go.
Oh, okay, well, I mean, I really appreciate Monisha's comments, but I was going to talk a bit more about maybe the more traditional style of test bed, the one with some designated sites and equipment and everything else. And you asked the question about accessibility to different stakeholders.
Absolutely.
And I really want to focus on the needs of one set of stakeholders that's really a key for both fundamental innovation and for translating those innovations into the market. And that's small experimental teams, academic R&D or small business entrepreneurs, right? So to meet the needs of these stakeholders, the National Test Bed has to enable experimentation with two characteristics. It has to be rapid and it has to be accessible. The experimentation is rapid if the delay between submitting a request and initiation of over-the-air experimentation is minimized. Any delays should come from technical factors and resource availability constraints, not from extended planning or authorization processes. Experimentation is accessible if cost and other barriers to small projects are minimized, and if most experimental capabilities are available to teams that include non-US citizens. So these requirements for rapid and accessible experimentation, they drive two design principles into the test bed. Number one is something that I think many folks have said in different contexts, which is if we're going to do sites, it should be a network of sites with different capabilities. We shouldn't try to fold it all into one site where everything happens. From this perspective, the driver for that is because the rapid turnaround needed for academic R&D and small business work is normally incompatible with the extensive planning that would be required for large DoD or public safety exercises. Also because the open, unclassified, and often non-US citizen involvement in this types of research needs to be properly separated from sensitive government experiments. The second design principle is that we need innovative regulatory support. Now, Monisha talked about one type, which I think is a really cool idea. But actually in the spectrum strategy, you'll see this thing called spectrum sandboxes. Places where you get rapid access to federal and non-federal spectrum with far fewer coordination delays than we see in current test beds. And that's really, really critical if we're going to have this vision of a national test bed actually able to really move the ball forward. I lead a National Science Foundation program called National Radio Dynamic Zones that is developing technology for automatic management of this type of special area, including automatic per-experiment coordination with nearby spectrum stakeholders. So our program is planning multiple field trials in the next several years. Our plan is to release software and model processes, a toolkit, if you will, that embodies the lessons we've learned from our work and hopefully help multiple national testbed sites implement spectrum sandboxes in the future. So the fundamental design principle here is that the national testbed design should be able to evolve to take advantage of these new spectrum technologies and these new regulatory approaches as they mature in the future.
Thank you, John. Anybody have anything else they'd like to add? Okay, we got.
So in panel 2, we talked about the importance of long-term planning. And so if we're still defining dynamic spectrum sharing as military or government and commercial sharing a band, these upcoming spectrum pipeline bands, then I kind of see the National Spectrum Testbed or one of the sites as a sandbox for experimental R&D and bringing commercial, academia, and government together earlier. Sometimes in the government, at NTIA at least, we can feel frustrated with the long time horizons and greenfield ideas coming from academia, but the government R&D cycles are just as long. And so if you can get people in all three of these communities working at the lower TRLs together in a real environment, because that's very important, then instead of seeing DSS added on with duct tape and super glue afterwards, it could be natively a part of both systems that have to dynamically share these bands. So I think it could really, the testbed could really spur cross-sector coordination and testing and align everyone's vision in the same direction versus thinking about everyone's priorities separately and then later coming together to solve the problem.
Thank you for that. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add, I'm not really a huge fan of test beds just because I think a lot of times you really can't design a single thing that can test enough things to make it clear whether you can share a band or not. I like Monisha's idea, and I also like John's idea of the National Radio Dynamic Zone, but when you think about reality, you think of like in the 3.1 gigahertz band, part of the PAS process, and I did not participate in the classified side, so I don't have to worry about divulging classified information, but there's a lot of unclassified systems in the band, and then there's some large classified number of classified systems that operate in the band as well. And I'm just trying to think, if you wanted a test bed to determine how well you could share the 3.1 gigahertz band, how's that going to work? Are you going to bring all 100 systems into the test bed and test, or do them one by one? I just, in practice, how could you use a test bed to prove out the ability to share something as complicated as the 3.1 gigahertz band? I just I don't see how that works.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I would like to second that. I think Monisha's idea about getting rapid FCC licenses for experimenters really gets to the heart of the issue, which is there's so many different ideas, and to investigate them, you need researchers capable of rapidly getting those licenses in place so they can test out the idea. In addition, I think we have to maybe turn around this notion of a national test bed, perhaps on its head, right? Maybe the idea should be, what kind of standards should be around that test bed? What kind of software and interfaces? But perhaps it shouldn't be like a physical thing. If you look at the trend in telecommunications, right, it's separating the logical entity from the physical entity. So I think the test bed maybe should be more of a logical notion and not necessarily a physical test bed.
Fascinating. It really is the different ideas and the different thoughts around what could be accomplished from a test bed. Certainly from John's perspective, we can certainly see that I think there is some value to being able to test systems as much as you can. And Andy makes a good point. You can't test everything. You can't have all the solutions, can't have all the answers. Certainly getting some answers and allowing folks to see that indeed dynamic spectrum sharing could work for a number of systems, I think would still be valuable. We are getting closer towards the end of the panel, having I think a very excellent discussion. I'm going to just quickly transition to a conversation around policy. This question again is a question for the entire panel, but perhaps Monisha and Andy might have some thoughts on what specific policy changes, including spectrum planning reforms, incentive programs, or even infrastructure investments, would you recommend to increase spectrum access and spectrum use efficiency?
So release a lot more information about government systems so industry can do their own analysis of how well it can be shared with. There's very little information, by design coming from the government about government systems. I understand that, radar is used for warfare or whatever, that's one situation. But if you look, say, in the 7 and 8 gigahertz band, which is on the table, there's a lot of stuff in there that isn't involved in warfare. Is it possible to release more information about that and let industry help the government do some of the analyses to figure out what could be shared and where? And to that extent as well, I'd say release as much as the GMF as you can. The GMF is a government master file. It's the listing of government frequencies and radio systems. And yes, like I said a minute ago, there are systems that clearly need to be protected and should not be released as part of the release of the GMF. But I used to be in the government. I used to be an IRAC representative. I've seen the GMF. There's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't need to be protected from the public, and there's no reason why it can't be publicly released. If the public, if industry, if other spectrum users have a better idea of where the government systems are and what their general characteristics are, in more detail than you get out of the NTIA spectrum summaries and things like that, we can help the government identify areas where spectrum sharing, areas I'm talking about in frequency and geography and in other dimensions where spectrum sharing could work the best. So I think just more information flow from the government side where it doesn't, put any risk on national security, I think would be a good policy change.
Thanks, Andy. Manisha?
So let me try to address that question from the other side. There's been a lot of discussion today and in general on on the commercial needs of wireless and how does the U.S. Retain its lead in the world. And I think what we should maybe focusing on from a policy point of view is the importance of broadband connectivity and not any particular kind of spectrum, whether it's unlicensed and shared and exclusively licensed. And the policy as to how a piece of spectrum gets repurposed. So I don't believe that sharing with high power outdoor mobile base stations is possible in many bands and in many places. But you do need that kind of spectrum too. So the spectrum policy should take into account end-to-end broadband connectivity. How are the different use cases needs of connectivity? It turns out that actually a lot of the verticals that 5G was supposed to address cannot be addressed very efficiently with a nationwide network. You need, say, local licensing at low to medium power to address some of those verticals. And that is a hard process because you want to look at what's in the band, what the use cases are, match them up, and try to sort of fit use cases to certain parts of the band and allocate them either on an exclusively licensed, medium power license, shared, or unlicensed basis.
Very interesting, comprehensive look at broadband and then trying to fit the right solutions to the problem. Makes a lot of sense. I wonder if anyone had any thoughts on potential policy changes that can improve access for underserved communities.
I think, local licensing, underserved communities as well as just encouraging innovation happens when access to spectrum is easier. Most people, most entities cannot spend $80 billion to get a piece of the pie. So in South Bend, the local school district set up a CBRS network to serve their school children who didn't have access to broadband during the pandemic, working very well. So I think to meet the needs of underserved rural communities, you really need to be able to put spectrum in the hands of those communities easier.
Brian?
Yeah, so to follow up on what Manisha is saying, so 5G has an ability to enable private networks. Basically, you can set up your own network as if you're the telecom operator. And most entities that do that use the public shared spectrum, namely CBRS, because they can't afford to purchase their own spectrum. So I think having more publicly available shared spectrum and to maybe give support to entities that want to create their own private networks would help solve that problem.
Excellent. I hesitate to ask this question, but I did let our panel know that this might be a question that we ask, so perhaps we'll see what happens when I ask this question. What additional spectrum policies could NTIA implement to increase experimentation and investment in new spectrum access models? Don't necessarily like giving ourselves homework, but if you guys had something, we're open to it. Oh, nothing I can hear. I see nothing. So we're doing a great job at NTIA. Well done, Mr. Cooper.
I think I may have come in too early, but I think your homework assignment would be go through the GMF and then, find those things that do need to be protected, and then everything else that doesn't release that information.
Touche.
Yes.
All right. So I didn't say we were going to take questions because I thought perhaps we would go a little longer. I don't know if we may have run out of time for questions from the audience, but I'll allow our panel, if they wanted to, if they had a question or a topic that they wanted to either pose to the other panelists or discuss as it pertains to obviously implementing a national spectrum strategy, I certainly welcome any topics or questions from the panel. I guess go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so I think one question or topic has to deal with the ability to integrate across the U.S. as well as outside of the U.S. through international standards, and the extent to which the strategy really embraces sort of international partners versus focuses maybe more internally.
Yeah. Certainly, that's a good point. And if all those who've read the strategy, it really was about kind of domestic policy. We didn't have a lot in the strategy, certainly in the pillars 1 and pillar 2 about specifically international policy or standards. Certainly, it's an important part of the national spectrum strategy. It's an important part of implementing approaches that allow for us to lead in global leadership and provide and produce innovation. But certainly you've read that it was really focused on domestic policy. Any other questions?
I'd like to comment on that. My experience has been that the spectrum innovation generally starts in the U.S. and then gets exported to other countries or to the ITU or whatever. It doesn't often flow the other way. And so I'm not sure how much our spectrum strategy has to take into account, how do we need to fit in with the rest of the world. I think, let's innovate here, and it will most likely be an exportable product. I mean, we get, as part of the CBRS community, we get requests to talk to other regulators about our experience with CBRS because they want to know, how's it working, what are the pain points, what's the successes, because they're looking at, how can they apply that to their licensing regimes. And, and other examples, but I guess, I'm a bit of a contrarian, and I'm not sure how much we need to fit ourselves into the international order as much as we just need to focus on our own innovation, and that'll probably end up being something that gets exported.
Thank you.
Just to add on to that, it's actually the CBRS model of local licensing, not so much sharing, has been adopted in many countries in Europe, even though they're not sharing with Navy radars. They just like the idea of shared local licensing. So countries like the UK and Germany are allocating, multiple hundreds of megahertz, and 3.8 to 4.2 is being harmonized in Germany for this kind of access. So, and maybe we can learn from them, so I think there's a continuous learning process. But I just wanted to quickly address something that was raised in the morning in one of the panels about speed of access to spectrum. What are the policies that can get a piece of spectrum out there really quickly? And I think about 2020 was the year that you had both the C-band and the 6 gigahertz rules come out. 6 gigahertz rules had two parts to it, which was the low power unlicensed indoors and the standard power. And the C-band also came out around the same time. In terms of how fast these rules got implemented, the unlicensed LPI devices were out within a year on the market, and APs and devices. C-band, within about 2 years, got deployed, and we're still waiting for the 6 gigahertz AFC. So sharing takes time. So true sharing, where you have to set up a third infrastructure to make sharing work, always takes longer. Unlicensed is quickest, exclusive license next, and then sharing.
Thank you. Well, I think we've come to the end of our panel time. I would like to thank our panel for a really fascinating discussion. Thanks to all those who are here to listen, And I think next up will be Scott Patrick. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Paul, and many thanks for our panelists for those wise insights. We're going to change gears a little bit here. We're going to turn the program over to William Kozma, who's from the Institute of Telecommunications Sciences, which is NTIA's research arm in Boulder. And after a short video introducing ITS, Bill's going to talk about some of the work that's going on at ITS right now, and including those activities we've been talking about today supporting the National Spectrum Strategy. And he's also going to be talking about the upcoming International Symposium on Advanced Radio Technologies, or ISART. I don't know if we're going to go straight to the video or if Bill's going to come up, but
the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences researches, tests, and evaluates advanced communication and information technology that touches every one of our lives on a daily basis, from the largest satellites and radar systems to the smallest smartphones and every communication device in between. ITS serves as the primary federal resource for solving telecommunication concerns for government agencies, industry, and for all of us. Telecommunication includes public safety networks, cell phones, even Netflix. For example, think of attending a concert trying to share your video of the band, but the slow speed and weak signal make it nearly impossible. That's because everyone else is trying to do the same thing. ITS analyzes video streaming technology and helps find ways to get your message to the world faster. Now, imagine trying to call for emergency help from that same crowded concert, but your signal is blocked or unclear. ITS works with first responders to make sure those messages get to them and they're able to communicate clearly with each other despite heavy usage and physical barriers. Is the speech clear? Is the video too grainy? Do cell towers interfere with radar? Are government communications secure? How can we all possibly share limited radio frequencies and wireless internet space in an ever-growing world of technology? These are the questions ITS is answering every day. The Institute for Telecommunication Sciences is recognized as one of the world's leading research facilities. ITS is finding ways to make sure science stays a step ahead of our critical communication and information technology needs.
I should also say that unlike the rest of NTIA, we get to be located in Boulder, Colorado, which is quite nice. Thanks, Scott. As you heard, my name's Billy Kozma. I'm the acting supervisor for the propagation modeling group in the technical theory division here at ITS, and I'm also co-chair of ISART 2024. And I'm here to talk to you about, and hopefully excite you to attend, the 2024 International Symposium for Advanced Radio Technology, or ISART 2024. The conference will be held in person in Denver, Colorado from June 10th to June 14th. ISART has historically been a place where we bring together agencies, industry, and academia to discuss focused topics within spectrum. For instance, at ISART 2010 and 2011, the topic of spectrum sharing with federal radars was discussed and worked. This jump-started a conversation between the multiple attendees on the technical and policy feasibility of such sharing approaches, eventually leading to, as you heard some of the panelists talking about, the 3.5 gigahertz CBRS band. In 2022, also referenced earlier, ISART brought together policymakers and industry to discuss key lessons learned from the recent spectrum sharing efforts, with recommendations on process improvement, spectrum sharing parameters, and which ideas warranted further research and stakeholder group involvement. As was mentioned, when we talked about the iterative rulemaking and how to address some of those ideas, they were discussed more fully at that ISART. Continuing this tradition, ISART 2024 will be on the topic of mid-band clutter. a topic that many of you know will be key to achieving the spectrum sharing goals set forth in the National Spectrum Strategy. So this morning we heard a bunch of different topics that, round around some really core concepts. Evidence-based, data, measurements, and ITS, as was mentioned, we're a research arm of NTIA. And all of those, I think, are really core. And those are some of the things that we look to talk to specifically in our ISAR conference. I'll also give a shout out. I heard Andy Clegg say that propagation was number 1 and 3, and that was nice to hear as someone who works heavily within the propagation space. The development, agreement on, and application of these propagation models take into account, that need to take into account the impact of building and foliage, what we refer to as clutter. These phenomena are critical to sharing and interference analysis. Some of the new spectrum identified in the National Spectrum Strategy is targeted for 5G and XG commercial cellular systems. These systems are generally concentrated in areas of large amounts of man-made clutter, and the accurate prediction of these clutter effects is critical to understanding to what extent and what methods can be used for spectrum sharing. At ISAR 2024, we'll dive deep into these topics that were discussed in this morning panels and the first one this afternoon, such as how can we acquire quality measurement data across multiple geographic locations and multiple frequency bands? How can we develop propagation models that can accurately predict the types of signal losses for a diversity of deployment scenarios, and then actually apply those to interference analyses? We heard some of the folks talk of clearly defining the problem, laying out the assumptions. We need those sort of information to motivate the development of our models so that the bridge between modeling and analysis is met. And lastly, how can we develop open, collaborative, transparent, and verifiable models in general? We talked about, I can't remember the speaker's name, they said, it was from the utilities, they mentioned they want to be able to perform repeatability of the analysis themselves. As a technical research arm, that's really important, right? When we publish and we do work, having the data available, having the modeling out there so they can be independently verified by others is really core to what really science is. Propagation modeling itself, however, isn't enough just to solve the spectrum sharing challenges of tomorrow. Just as important is the application of models to sharing environments and the design of the sharing and interference analyses themselves. Often this step is riddled with competing assumptions, incomplete information, and inconsistent methodologies. ISAR 2024 will look closer at bridging the gap between propagation modeling and interference analysis and how this process can be improved for the upcoming spectrum bands. Leading to ISAR 2024, the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences is working to kickstart a more transparent and collaborative environment by moving to publicly release over 100 clutter measurement data sets comprising over 6 million data points in the 3 to 4 gigahertz band. In addition, we're moving towards open sourcing beta clutter models that are currently under active development on GitHub. National Spectrum Strategy talks about establishing collaborative processes to improve spectrum management analysis. ISAR 2024 will dive deeper into this area for clutter modeling, and ITS hopes that our initial public releases demonstrates a commitment to these ideas and can act as a springboard for other agencies and other groups going forward within these spaces. A lot of the work still needs to be done to execute on these ambitious goals set forth in the Spectrum Strategy. Going hand in hand with achieving these goals is ensuring that we have the spectrum workforce available to accomplish them. And the next panel this afternoon will be discussing this topic more fully. If we look around the room, we see a lot of familiar faces, but not necessarily a lot of new ones. Sharing and interference analysis continue to become more complicated with technological advancements of the systems. It's imperative that we find a way to grow a new generation of spectrum engineers to support the work that needs to be done to maximize the usage of our finite spectrum resource. This has, again, been a reoccurring theme that we all agree on, and we need to make progress towards. In a new twist at ISAR 2024, we'll be looking to roll out the Codeathon or software competition to expose students and junior engineers to best practices in the use and application of propagation models to scenarios of modeling and analysis. More information on this will be followed in the coming months. Lastly, ISAR 2024 will have a unique international flavor to it. ITS is hosting the 2024 ITUR Study Group 3 Working Party meetings in Denver, Colorado in the 2 weeks preceding ISART. This will be the first meetings of Study Group 3 since the conclusion of the World Radio Conference in the fall, where new agenda items were agreed upon for Work 27. In particular, Agenda Item 1.7 calls out the 7.125 8.4 gigahertz band to study for the possible sharing with IMT or commercial cellular systems. This band directly overlaps with the band specified in the National Spectrum Strategy, and ISART 2024 plans to bring in the global experts from Study Group 3 to participate in our conversations of modeling and analysis. Spectrum is critical to the diverse range of objectives within the United States of America, from the operations of safety of life systems to the support of economic drivers of commercial technological advancement. ISART looks to support those objectives by focusing on a specific and critical component of spectrum management, the spectrum management puzzle, in particular clutter modeling. From discussions ranging from measurement and modeling to analysis and methodologies, ISART 2024 is positioned to be the initial stepping stone in a much longer conversation over the next couple of years. Thank you for your time, and we hope to see you all in Denver this June.
Thanks for those comments and for the video, and we're going to do some real time. I think the fourth panel is ready to go, so let me introduce them. This is the fourth panel for the fourth pillar, and we're going to be talking with the workforce and public outreach, and our NTIA Senior Advisor Phil Murphy will be the moderator. So I'm vamping, and here he comes. And I'll have Phil set up the panel and introduce them. So Phil Murphy.
All the way down. There you go. All right, perfect. Hey, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Let's let the panel just get seated for a second. There you go. All right. Some slight musical chairs here. There you go. It's my fault. Well, first off, I just want to thank our panelists for joining us here today, and I want to thank those of you here in the room and watching online. We're here today to talk about Pillar 4 of the National Spectrum Strategy, which is focused on growing our spectrum workforce, raising awareness and understanding about this critical resource. You've heard a lot today about the need for more spectrum by both the federal government and the private sector, and I hope it's clear that we're seeing a lot of demand from all parties as the private sector is increasingly relying on spectrum to develop new products and services, and federal agencies are using spectrum in new and innovative ways to advance their missions as well. Through the other pillars of the strategy, we're working to find a way to ensure that we have the spectrum resources to do both. This panel and this pillar of the strategy is really focused on the question of how we ensure that we have the workforce and the talent to make use of this spectrum and these new opportunities. How do we raise public awareness about how important this resource is and how important it increasingly is becoming? And then ultimately an understanding by policymakers about what this stuff is that we're talking about here and why it's so valuable, and ultimately how we make good decisions about how we use it now and in the future as we're thinking about how we allocate it. And we've got an excellent panel of folks here who spent much of their lives thinking about these issues and working on solutions. So with that, I'd love to introduce, here we go. First off, we've got RJ Belenga. He serves as Deputy Director at the Spectrum and Policy Planning Division at NASA headquarters. RJ joined NASA in November 2015 and currently serves as Principal Advisor to the Spectrum Policy and Planning Director. He also leads various NASA strategic initiatives focused on spectrum professional education and outreach initiatives. Next off, we have Dr. Cheryl Jenko, Vice President of Advanced Technology at Ericsson. She also serves as on the Executive Committee of the National Spectrum Consortium. Cheryl was also the Laboratory Director at NTIA's Institute for Telecommunication Sciences in Boulder and is a former colleague. Her contributions have been at the forefront of critical technology areas impacting federal and commercial programs, including spectrum efficiency, sharing and auctions, 5G and broadband, satellite communications, unmanned aviation systems, and radio sciences. Next off, we've got Dr. Nick Lanneman, the founding director of SpectrumX, an NSF Spectrum Innovation Center, and co-director of the Wireless Institute in the College of Engineering, and a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at the University of Notre Dame. He joined the faculty in 2002, shortly after earning his PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. And his research areas include wireless system design, radio spectrum access, technology standards, intellectual property, and regulatory policy. And then finally, we have Phil Karn. Phil is past president and current director of American Radio Digital Communications, Inc. He was a radio amateur in high school, and this was central to his pursuit of electrical engineering degrees at Cornell and CMU, and a career in applied research at Bell Labs, Bell Communications Research, and Qualcomm, where he made pioneering contributions to digital radio communications. He's retired, but remains incredibly active in the space in amateur radio at ARDC by mentoring local high school radio clubs, by writing and distributing open source software, including multi-channel software-defined radio, and his amateur radio call sign is KA9Q. We have a really amazing panel for you, and I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So I'm going to ask a question to sort of all the panelists, and we're going to sort of go down the line. Spectrum's the driving force behind so many of the technologies and innovations that we rely on every day, right? From 5G to Wi-Fi to weather prediction and GPS. It's a resource that's very heavily used by both the federal government and the private sector. And it's something that people take for granted and don't really understand. I've been working in this space for a long time. My wife still doesn't understand what I do. And I think one of the strategic objectives of Pillar 4 of the National Spectrum Strategy is to improve the public understanding about what spectrum's role is in everyday life, right, to tell that story. Why do each of your organizations care so much about spectrum? And how does telling that story help you educate and engage the public? RJ, how does NASA view this?
Well, first of all, Phil, thank you for having me. It's great to be on this panel, especially now that there is inclusion of this workforce development pillar onto that national level. So from a NASA standpoint, as we know, NASA, we do a lot of things for utilizing wireless spectrum from space and human space flight, science, and then the one thing you can't forget is the first A in NASA, the aeronautic side of things. So not only are our missions and science products help with the understanding of our planet, the way we do business, and space and the celestial bodies, we are an organization that's always been developing emerging technologies, and we use those emerging technologies, we put them out into the public domain as spin-offs, and then the public utilizes them for everyday uses for other things. Much of what NASA does for humans, for the human race, is tied to spectrum. There's human space flight, satellite communication and navigation, observing the Earth, and of course science, like we said already. I think it's unfair that I go first here because storytelling, it's easy for NASA. The NASA brand, the NASA product, the NASA logo is very recognizable, and it's global. So everybody wants to listen to NASA. They want to hear, they want to engage. But to take that piece back is, it's part of that storytelling. What do we say in our words, in our narratives, to tie in spectrum, the use of spectrum, the necessity of spectrum, the criticality of spectrum, and engaging with those who are not familiar with spectrum, and get them interested and learning about more about spectrum. So,
Thank you. Cheryl?
Hi, everybody. So while NASA has the NASA cachet, Ericsson brings you all your cat videos. Okay? So right now, I am with Ericsson. I'm the Vice President of Advanced Technology. And what I bring to Ericsson is my absolutely love for knowledge, absolute love for continuous learning, and for engineering. As an electrical engineer, I can geek out with the best of them, and and as a lot of you in this room know, that's really where I sit. I sit in that innovation space that some of our guests were speaking about earlier today. So as far as Ericsson goes, Ericsson's a hardcore engineering company. I have never been surrounded by so many really deep technical people in my life. It's been really very exciting to be there. And so they really embrace everything that Spectrum has to offer from Ericsson's standpoint. But what they also do is, Ericsson and myself, they allow this whole idea of continuous learning, this whole idea of getting the word out, this whole idea of, having a leadership, a technical leadership around important areas such as spectrum. Coop is probably the coolest cat in the room, but then because of spectrum, right? So there's a number of pieces I think we're going to get to as far as how I personally support our workforce development, but I must say that that's really one of the best parts of my job is in all the workforce development activities and my passion that I have for STEM education. Just last year, RJ and I probably talked for about an hour about STEM education, and I'm always on Nick's back about sending me some more electrical engineers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick, and we'll have more of a conversation about other ways that we use Spectrum and educate the community.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. It's good to have you on my back. I was a little hesitant when RJ brought up NASA's brand. I don't know if I should bring up Notre Dame's brand. There's probably the go-to of Notre Dame football, but I guess I do want to stress that Notre Dame's mission is to be a force for good in the world. And that phrase, force for good, was brought up earlier today, and it really resonates. So as Phil said, I have two hats. I do teaching and research as a faculty member at Notre Dame. And I help lead a wireless center that focuses on research and teaching there. And I also am leading the NSF Spectrum X Innovation Center. And that involves 30 universities, 30 member institutions, mostly universities. And so really what we're trying to do is create opportunities for students and faculty, and increasingly public scholarship, being able to contribute to this ecosystem and help address problems, and along the way, train our students and create opportunities for those students. There's tremendous work that needs to be done, and it's very exciting, and increasingly the faculty are starting to see that there's more that they can learn themselves. We're developing the faculty expertise along the way because of this broad set of uses, exciting set of uses around the radio spectrum. I'll pause there.
I wanted to say that basically that amateur radio, which probably most of you have heard of, is, while it's thought of as a nominally recreational service, people go in as a hobby, and you can think of it as a national park system of the airwaves, but it's really much more than that. I see it fundamentally, having been involved in it for 52 years now, as an educational system. It's much more informal than you might think of as, say, going to school, although it's often worked in school programs as well. But it's a type of education that involves very hand-on, intuitive learning that is really almost impossible to get in any other way. In fact, I've interviewed probably hundreds of candidates to become colleagues, engineers in my career. And one of the things I always looked for was a ham radio license. Of course, that was especially true at Qualcomm since we did radio. But the people who came in with hams, especially the students, I mean, they had just a different take on things. They had a much more intuitive understanding because they had done this themselves. They had learned through amateur radio. And we were rarely disappointed. Several of Qualcomm's founders were radio hams, and they also had what I would consider a very intuitive understanding, especially of things like propagation. I heard in an earlier panel session that we needed to know more about propagation. Well, hams have been intensely interested in propagation since the service was created. Hams also talk to each other. We coordinate. Believe me, if I get on the air and I transmit something that interferes, I will hear about it. Okay, so I was surprised to hear that there was a problem with some other services, a coordination doing some of the spectrum sharing. So amateur radio, while it is nominally a hobby, most people think of it that way, it really is an educational service, and I think that's why it needs to be protected and prepared. It has small allocations all the way from the low frequency band up through the millimeter wave band, which, as you know, have vastly different properties and propagation characteristics, and encourages, of course, experimentation and familiarization with all of them. It not only does it help people to learn, it brings several of them into STEM fields, many of them in the STEM fields, specifically electrical engineering, and I'm an example. My own fascination with ham radio began during the Apollo program, which I guess dates me. I was fascinated by the fact that it took a major national effort to send 2 men to the moon, but that I, as an individual, could put up an antenna and hear them. One ham actually received Neil Armstrong's backpack transmitter during his moonwalk. He received it directly without even going through the relay system. To me, that was just mind-blowing that an individual could do that. And I just got fascinated. And from there, I went and got double E degrees, and I went into my career starting at Bell Labs in applied research. And all through this, I was basically, living, my whole life was basically communications, both the amateur side and my hobby side and my professional life. And one of the things I want to say about ham radio when it comes to technical experimentation is we often do things before anybody else is interested. A good example of that is that in the mid-'80s, I wrote an internet protocol package for the PC. As far as I know, it was the first one that was a complete implementation. And we were running the internet protocols over radio in the 1980s when nobody else was interested. Nobody else could even see any use for this. I mean, it's hard to believe now, but that really was true. But because I did that, I got the attention of some of the guys at Qualcomm, specifically the hams, and they brought me out there, and I started marrying this technology with their CDMA digital technology that they were developing in the mid-'90s. And even there, I had a hard time selling everybody, why would you want to carry a fax machine down the street to send data? That makes sense to anybody. But I think I won out in the end. I mean, I think I showed, that there was a use for this. But that's another thing about ham radio that I think is fascinating, is that we do stuff simply because it's fun. And that's often long before anybody has any thought of doing commercial use of this stuff. As far as I know, the only other people doing this at that time were the military. And they're doing it with extremely expensive hardware. We were doing it with something that we could afford as individuals. So not only do we experiment, we innovate, we educate, I think we also innovate, and often very early compared to, much earlier than you might think.
Thank you. So another strategic objective of Pillar 4 is really to attract, train, and grow that next generation spectrum workforce. And RJ, NASA is really leading the way within the federal government in terms of education, outreach, training, and this is really a passion of yours. How is it critical to NASA's goals for exploration and discovery to have a world-leading workforce in spectrum-related fields? And what are the initiatives that you guys have launched to achieve those?
Thanks, Phil. First of all, I just want to say thank you to my leadership. Without leadership and without their advocacy, without their investments, none of what we've been doing in SPEARS, that's the Spectrum Education Awareness, I'll talk a little bit more about that, one of our initiatives, would not be possible. That's one of the things that we need to do as we progress this next Pillar 4, is obtain the advocacy. You know, from all the way from our leadership within our agencies, but also across the federal government. And we need to start talking and collaborating like we do on spectrum issues and spectrum challenges every day, but this is just another challenge. It's a spectrum workforce gap. So one of the other things that we've been, one of NASA's goals is to support the National Space Council and their priorities. So within the National Space Council, one of their priorities and one of their goals is to ensure and sustain U.S. leadership in space. When I look at that, when I read that, and I interpret that, that's not only U.S. leadership in space, that's not just NASA, but that's our brothers and sisters in the federal agency, NOAA, the DoD, as well as our commercial partners. But it doesn't stop there. It's global. You know, we work in tandem and we collaborate with a lot of international spectrum partners. So when we continue that leadership in space and marrying that up with education and trying to ensure that the U.S. is leading that forefront, we are outreaching to those domestic partners as well as international partners. And we've been working with some countries like Germany and Nigeria, because they just don't have the mechanisms already in place to educate new workforce. Then on that same token, there's emerging countries out there from developing nations as well that are also coming and want to be involved in that space race. So we are also helping them to educate their workforce with processes and just basic understanding of the technical. But you know, one of the other things that we want to ensure, you know, with all of this, you know, going back to the initiatives question that you had, we started SPEARS, the Spectrum Education Awareness, back in, well, we started the investigations back in 2018. We've been implementing activities from 2019 till now. We're on phase 2 of our work efforts there. And we're looking at a 4-phased approach. You know, when we first stood this up, it's to educate our spectrum professionals. That's one. And then also our spectrum user community, too. The other, number 3, is our spectrum partners and collaborators. Not everybody knows about space. Not everyone knows about science. So we have to educate them as well. How do we do business? And then, of course, the 4th pillar there is reach out, like what Cheryl and Nick are doing. It's engaging that STEM community. We have to create that interest into Spectrum so we can have a robust pipeline of folks coming in. There's a whole bunch of other different stories behind that or challenges. One is educating and generating that interest, but then is it that pipeline? You know, how do we ensure that there are billets, positions for these younger generations to come in and fulfill?
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and I think we see like a lot of need on the federal side. Cheryl, you've seen this issue from the federal side when you were director at ITS, but also now at Ericsson and in other positions in the private sector. I think when you think about the fierce competitive challenges in selling radios and radio access networks globally, what steps is the wireless industry taking to recruit talent and make sure you have the human capital to be competitive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just a little bit more about, I just want to just riff a little bit on what Phil said. I think we have to somehow make it fun, because I'm in this because it's fun. I think it's fun to do things with, in the labs, and I think that's how I got involved in it, and we have to somehow make it all fun. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story, and then I'll answer your question. During COVID, my children came home, and they were in college, and my one daughter, so I've donated two engineers to the world, by the way, but my one daughter was taking some courses with a professor, and she started screaming and screaming, "Mom, you got to come here, you got to listen to this." he started talking about NTIA. And I was at ITS at the time. And I said, oh my gosh, what's he saying? Well, he was very thoughtful. What he was saying was how in the past, perhaps more non-technical folks were making a lot of the policy decisions and were having most of the input into the spectrum decisions, and how going forward that spectrum is getting so crowded and it's getting so much more complex that we need more and more technical people. Well, with that, I, of course, reached out to Joseph. He's at Northeastern, by the way. He's a great guy, terahertz guy. And we had this great conversation about how we can energize the people that he teaches, for example, at Northeastern, to get into spectrum and to go into these fields. So it's real for me. It's real on a lot of levels. What does Ericsson do? Well, Ericsson allows me to come here and speak to you all about these things, as well as supports the National Spectrum Consortium, on which I sit as a member, as an executive committee member, where in the last 2 years, the National Spectrum Consortium and Ericsson and its membership, 400 some odd companies and universities, have started a national scholarship for spectrum for, college-age women in spectrum. In the last 2 years, we've awarded 7 scholarships and have had one more fantastic recipient than the next, and all those interviews and whatnot are on the National Spectrum Consortium's YouTube channel. But suffice to say, we're really trying to get those kinds of things in place. The last thing, as far as Ericsson goes, is, Ericsson's soup to nuts. And so we have 4 centers of excellence where we do training and upskilling of workers to do tower climbing and to install the systems. And it's a very technical part of the job, as well as physical, because they have to have the microwave orientations. They have to understand how to do that, how to read what, like various diagnostic equipment to put these things up. And it's quite spectacular, these centers of excellence. So I just want to point ourselves to the fact that, yes, STEM is super important, but not everybody has to be in front of a computer screen. There's a certain amount of STEM that happens out there in the wild as well. And then finally, in Ericsson, we have our Texas Smart Factory, where we have 5G making 5G. It's super cool. You guys, if you ever get a chance to see it, it's really cool to see. And what we've done there, because we've used technology, we've used industrial IoT technology, we use 5G technology, we're able to we have a whole team of people, like 5 people, who all came from Chipotle. Literally, we got this one woman who's spectacular in first. We trained her up, and then she said, I know some other people that would love to come here and work. And so, there's this whole team, and they're like our best technical team in that factory, and they're spectacular. So this whole idea of continuous learning, upskilling, supporting our engineers as they go through school and as they have opportunities to have internships is really a bunch of very important steps towards getting that workforce established for our country.
Do you encourage them to get their ham licenses?
That's funny, because I used to have my own company, and if they used to work on cars, I would hire them. So I had a similar thing, but not the ham licenses.
It's an interesting dynamic. We're going to get into it in a little bit. Nick, I think as an educator, right, and running a research institution, getting people in spectrum can be challenging at universities, particularly when there's a lot of competition, for majors and getting students interested early on, particularly for something that's complex and esoteric in some respects like spectrum. How do you get folks interested? How do you, to Cheryl's point, how do you make it fun for them? And how do you sort of mentioned, getting your colleagues interested as well, people who maybe are working in a STEM field but not working on spectrum. And it seems like Spectrum X sort of sits sort of at the heart of that, trying to kind of create those interdisciplinary connections, not just to bring people in, but also to kind of draw people together.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's been an interesting journey. We've seen in the last 15 years or so a decline, generally speaking, in the interest in electrical engineering, which is one of the the foundations of RF and spectrum-related work. And so there's kind of an existential crisis in some sense to try to find ways to attract more students to electrical engineering in particular, but these related fields in general. the way that we've been approaching it is trying to better understand the why. Why is spectrum so important? And tell that story before we teach the Fourier transform, right? When I was a student, probably when many of us were students, we took the signals and systems class and learned all the math and did those problems, but I had no sense of the many, many, many amazing applications of that concept and those technologies at the time. So we've kind of flipped the script. We start with the why. We talk about these different uses of spectrum. We talk about how important they are in society. And then that motivates diving deeper and developing the theory. So that's one approach that we're doing both in my class and in our center, and getting undergrads involved in research. Often we try to make sure that we identify opportunities for the students. So what's the career trajectory? What's the pathway from taking the signals and systems class to being a spectrum leader? And I think that's why, among many reasons, we appreciate what NASA's been doing in the SPEARS effort, because it helps us characterize what the opportunities are in the federal government and more broadly around spectrum careers. The other thing that we try to do is I take the mindset that I'll do anything twice, just about anything twice. And so we're exploring new ways of collaborating through Spectrum X in particular. And we try to explore an opportunity, distill it, simplify it, and then make it attractive to other faculty. Try to make it easy for other faculty to get involved. So as an example of that, we're really grateful NTIA has invested in some collaborations between faculty and Spectrum X and folks in ITS and also the Office of Spectrum Management. I took the lead on just trying to rough that out and get it started. It was painful, getting all the documentation in place, getting a CRADA in place, but it was well worth it. Now we have 3 more people taking on the role of a liaison, working between Spectrum X and bringing other faculty in and working with NTIA. So being creative, looking for new ways to collaborate, breaking down barriers and silos, as hard as it is on the front end, it's worth it in the long term.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So, Phil, you're the director of the Amateur Radio Digital Communications Organization, and it's really focused on empowering the future of amateur radio and digital communications. And it seems like, just in talking about this with you, there's a really big emphasis again on sort of making this fun. And I think, as we're talking about with Nick, there's real competition for kids' attention, particularly kids, right? Between, their screens and other kinds of things that are trying to capture their attention. How are you guys trying to get them engaged and get them to keep coming back and get them to potentially make this like a lifelong passion?
Okay. First, I'd just say what ARDC is, Amateur Radio Digital Communications. It's a nonprofit foundation that we formed in 2019, and we endowed it with the sale of some surplus IP addresses that we got in the early 80s specifically to run TCP/IP, the Internet Protocols, over radio, my project. That's how I came across that. We make grants of about $5 million a year, and we make them spread across education, research and development, and general R&D. And we're new at this. We only started this in 2019, so we're still finding our way to find out what you're talking about. We put money into just straight scholarships. We put money into educational programs that are brought to us and described to us, and we also try to fund R&D projects that are specifically ham-related and are also open source. We will not fund anything as proprietary. It has to be made open to the whole amateur community. So we're still feeling our way around on that. I mean, we sort of have an intuitive feel. I mean, from having been a student myself, and most of the other directors having come from very similar backgrounds. But we know that by making it fun, by getting them young, that's an important thing. I mean, I became a ham at 15. I think I was an old man by that time. There were a lot of hams I've known that were, hams much younger than me. And just emphasizing the sense of fun. I mean, kids learn best when they don't realize they're learning, right? I mean, that's a cliche, but it's true, right? And then later on, I discovered when I went to school, for example, when I sat in a class on plasma physics, that hey, this is how the ionosphere works. This actually makes sense to me now. So, you were talking about sitting in signals and systems. I didn't have that experience. I knew what this stuff was all about, right? So having a ham license actually helped in my engineering education when I got that far. And of course, the education filled a lot of holes. I mean, there's still a very good reason to go to school. It fills in a lot that you don't know. But it does instill this sense of fun early on. And we would like to get them young, because that's when kids are still very curious, right? It's one thing, unfortunately, a lot of schools, beat out of the kids once they get older, is the sense of curiosity. And we would really like to, take advantage of that while we can.
Oh, I think it's a great point. And it strikes me, Phil and Nick, that both of your organizations are really focused on engaging young people and getting them to engage in the subject matter and to think about this as like an ongoing interest. But like, as we think about the sort of pressures that you all have talked about of the kind of spectrum workforce and the need to really expand the pool, I'm kind of curious what your organizations are doing to engage women and girls and communities that are traditionally underserved. And I'm going to ask RJ and Cheryl the sort of same question. But for you guys, I know your organizations have been working on this issue, and it is a passion as you're thinking about how do we solve this challenge? And really, it seems to some extent like it's expanding the scope and trying to bring people in who've been potentially historically excluded.
Well, we've given grants to some Indian tribes in remote areas. Specifically, they set up Wi-Fi networks. It wasn't actually ham radio, but it was Wi-Fi. We have given a grant, for example, to the Society of Women Engineers. We're looking around. We found a few minority scholarship funds. But, as I said, we've only been at this for about 4 years. Ask us in a while, we might have a better idea. But we're looking for answers. We're looking for ideas also. Oh, by the way, I should mention earlier that NASA and Amateur Service have had a long, very productive partnership. Hams have been launching satellites since literally the early 60s. First amateur satellites went up. The CubeSat concept, which some of you may have heard out, that comes out of ham radio. We invented that until it took off and eclipsed us. And then there's the space station. There was an amateur radio in the International Space Station project, which has gone on now for quite some time and is really successful. I mean, space just still excites kids. That seems to be an unchanging fact, right? So space is just this wonderful way to get kids hooked. The first time I watched an Eris contact in person, and I saw the looks on these kids' faces, when the astronauts talked back to them, I said, we got to do this. I mean, we have to fund this. This is a really good idea. It's simple as it seems. Just talking to an astronaut seems simple enough. It just gets these kids hooked in a way that I've never seen or rarely seen anything else do it. So little things like that, even if they may seem like gimmicks, to a kid, they work, right? We got to keep finding them.
Yeah, there's some magic in NASA.
There's some magic, yeah.
Yeah, Nick.
So let me try to summarize some of the activities that Spectrum X is pursuing. Just to take a step back, as I said, we're 30 institutions across the country, primarily focusing on interdisciplinary research, policy outreach and engagement to try to have impact in the spectrum ecosystem. But a very important part of our mission as this National Center for Spectrum Research and Spectrum Innovation is education and workforce development. So we've spent a fair amount of time. We're about 2 years in to our grant from NSF, which we're very grateful for. But we spent about a year in a planning process as well. So we've been thinking about this problem for about 3 years and working on it. Because we're 30 institutions, we did not imagine that we could develop some kind of new degree program and have everybody agree to it. So what we've done instead is focus on developing courseware that can be reused at all of our institutions and even more broadly. We're focusing on that at the middle school, high school level, at the undergraduate level, and then we've also got some interdisciplinary survey courses that we're developing at the master's level. The idea is, again, raise awareness, build interest in the radio spectrum ecosystem as a whole, because that's really, I think, one of the most attractive selling points to a young learner today, is that if you develop a certain amount of expertise, you've got job security because you have a lot of opportunities in this field. So we are developing that content in such a way. We're probably farthest along on the middle school, high school materials. 20 lessons have been published at this point, and they're distributed through the STEM education community. They can be downloaded and applied by any middle school or high school teacher. We even have resources to train the teachers on how to use those materials. And so I'm happy to give you pointers to that. If you know, if your child is at a school and you want to get them exposed, if you've got nieces and nephews that you want to get them exposed through their schools, we can put those teachers in touch with these materials. The other dimension that we're pretty far along on is with the master's level. And in that activity, we're really engaging the community. We're trying to bring in key representatives from different organizations, one of whom is up here on the stage with me from NASA. We want them to tell the story of their mission and the systems they're deploying, the frequencies that are relevant, maybe hint at some of the interference or coexistence issues that are out there. But for the most part, just, again, building interest and awareness so that students can get excited about the field and want to go take follow-on courses where they go deeper. And so, again, that stuff is developing. We're planning on 3 courses. They will ultimately be posted on Coursera so that someone can obtain a specialization in this field. But all of the content will be reusable at our respective institutions for their 4-credit offerings as well. So those are some ways that we're trying to engage and develop new innovative materials for educational purposes. We've also got some programs focused on undergraduate research, collaborative research, again with industry and government. And we've also got some citizen science projects lined up where students can obtain a low-cost RTL SDR sensor and start to learn about the radio spectrum and take measurements in a relatively low-cost, low barrier to entry kind of way.
I like that you're working with the teachers. That's critical. You know, my experience with high school clubs, you can't do anything without a motivated, involved teacher.
Yeah.
Really important.
I was going to say, Cheryl, I know this has been like a particular passion for you, getting kids not just involved in engineering, but STEM in general. And I was curious, like, you know, how you see targeting kids for STEM as a pathway to get into these fields.
To say it's a passion is an understatement. So I've created a K-8 math science charter school. Over 20,000 kids have gone through that K-8 school already. Because I think it was Nick who said you got to get them early, right? You got to get them hooked early. You got to have fun. Was it you, Phil? It was one of these two. So that was really something that when it was 2 years of my life while my kids were eating peanut butter and ice pops. But nonetheless, I was so passionate about it, and I'm so thankful that it's still there. I developed the curriculum, the scope and sequence, and really it lives on in infamy, so to speak, but it's won all kinds of awards, and I'm very thankful that public school's in existence. I also want to say that these two guys didn't really answer your question, right? One of these things is not like the other up here, okay? And that thing is me. Okay, I'm the only one up here who happens to be a woman, who happens to know what it's like to be a girl in engineering. And I think if Monisha's still in the audience, she can attest to our fantastic reception at IEEE Milcom last year. I had Dr. Monisha Ghosh and Dr. Mary Shergott and myself on stage to welcome those recipients of the 2023 Women in Spectrum Scholarship. And I think the power is in us women, speaking about our accomplishments, our patents, our technical work, and that gets these other young people, whether they're girls or boys, men or women, excited about the field. And I know Monisha and Mary would also agree with me because we had quite the event. We had a 900-person standing ovation. So if you want statistics about engineering and electrical engineering, I have them all, and they're terrible. Okay, we have to do something as a country to get more electrical engineers in the pipeline and more electrical engineers who have actually taken field theory. The National Spectrum Consortium Committee that picks the scholarship winners pretty much hates me because if a student doesn't have field theory on their transcript, I put them in the trash. So because that is the intent of the scholarship. The intent of the scholarship is around strong electrical engineering, people who understand spectrum, field theory, period. That's the intent of it. And so those are some of the ways that I personally have been a proponent of that. But I think overall, our country needs to find new ways to get more and more people into engineering, into STEM fields, into perhaps ancillary fields such as, like these centers of excellence that Ericsson has as far as tower climbers and technicians. They're all super important. In Colorado, I am also on the board of directors for Colorado Labs. And one of the things we all get together and talk about, there's industry and the laboratory directors and things, we talk about the need for really advanced technicians, really advanced folks who can help, with all of the problems that we have, building satellites, radios, et cetera, across the board. And there are some unique programs out there, but it's a soup to nuts responsibility for all of us to get people interested in those fields and really excited about it in some way. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but for me, it's a real lifelong passion, and I want to thank Monisha. And then as far as NSF goes, just one other thing. I thought John Chapin was here, and these lights are very, very bright up here. Oh, hi, John. Yeah, and so like I had the luxury of being on stage at the Capitol building with Punch. And what we were talking about was this very, very idea, because through the U.S. CHIPS and Science Act, one of the recipients is a consortium of colleges where all of the deans happen to be women, deans of engineering, and it's called EDGE, the EDGE Consortium. And Panch and I were on stage to sort of talk about how do we encourage STEM, how do we encourage engineering? And this was funded through CHIPS and Science Act because of the semiconductor aspects of it, right? And so I really want to thank NSF as well as all these other initiatives that you're doing and others for supporting those very important concepts of getting people in there young, keeping them in engineering. How many of us who are engineers know about the weed out classes that first semester, right? Right? And so critical to that conversation with Panch was about internships. Open your companies, open your minds to having interns come in and really work. Every single one of the 7 recipients of the NSC scholarship had some form of an internship, a research program, an internship, someone who took her under their belts, and really showed them what to do with it, to your point, gentlemen. It's like, and that's where they got the excitement. That's where they decided to really stay in engineering. And so really try to find those ways to have internships for students, because that's really our future.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think beyond equity, right, it's about leveraging human capital, right? We need to find talent, we need to use talent, and we need to particularly find people and populations that haven't really participated in these sectors of the economy, because that's where the real growth potential is. RJ, I know this is also a real passion for you too.
Yeah, I just, my colleagues here to my left, I totally agree with their initiatives. We need to, the STEM community has grown throughout the ages. We, no doubt, have recognized that. And, I really applaud all the things that Cheryl and Monisha are doing, engagement with the women into the STEM fields, and to Spectrum getting raising that awareness. We need to leverage more on that, So I'm not going to talk about that a little bit more, but being the only federal employee on the panel, I'll talk a little bit from a different lens. Trying to get women into spectrum engineering or spectrum management, into STEM, reaching out to the tribal communities. What kind of initiatives can we do to help that out? Through the recruitment phase, sometimes it's very difficult for somebody that doesn't know, they only know what they know, right? So that's why I really love working with the education system, developing curriculum, developing courses that is widespread. You teach, you give an idea, you give a curriculum to the physics professors, and then that way, that is outreach through that education community, down and outwards, but also up and in, that will bring some of those and create those interests into those underserved areas and minority areas. But from a recruitment standpoint, what we also need to do is look at, things that, unfortunately, the pandemic has provided us. There is a silver lining here. We have the opportunities for remote work. We have opportunities for hybrid work environment, broader participation in forums such as this. I mean, those online today watch it. We need to also ensure that there is enough awareness in those communities that they listen to some, the symposium today. Also leveraging on some of the other initiatives. Cheryl and Nick and Phil already have talked about some of their initiatives, but we are engaged, and I know NTIA is very engaged with the U.S. Telecommunications and Training Institute. They're outreaching to developing nations on their spectrum needs. So, that's another insight, where we need to go there. But overall, we need to be, from a federal government standpoint, we can't wait for those individuals to come to us. We need to be outreaching to them. Because, again, they only know what they know. And if they don't know, we need to be more proactive, be more forward-leaning, and reaching out to those communities.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And, so part of the spectrum strategy calls for the creation of a national spectrum workforce plan. And it focused not just on training and recruiting of RF engineers, but sort of that full range of technical, operational, and policy positions that's needed to kind of run robust spectrum programs. So, RJ, at NASA, you guys rely on spectrum for everything, right? I think we think about, a rocket launch, and it's not just a pile of fuel with a capsule on top, right? There's enormous amount of spectrum that's used at every phase of the process, and then keeping that satellite in orbit. From your perspective and your organizational perspective, why is it so important that we have a plan that's broad, right? That encompasses sort of this really broad workforce that can sort of fulfill a wide range of roles?
Oh, no, great question. One of the things that we've recognized under SPEARS and in our activities is that spectrum has changed. The way we did spectrum 10, 15 years ago is not the same spectrum that we do today. So I really, we've made a shift, a paradigm shift from using spectrum management. Because spectrum management, it's either you have some management, technical management type skills, or it's typically related to engineers. I like to call them spectrum professionals, because that's more inclusive of some of the activities that we're pursuing under our current plan. The national development of a national plan needs to be robust. And I'm going to try to hammer this a few times, but this is some of the three things, our top three things that we engage with or we use under SPEARS. 1, we educate. 2, we engage. And 3, we outreach. So in any community that we have, when we're talking to, is whether it's engineers, whether it's lawyers, whether it's young STEM community, kids in the community. The 4 audiences that I talked about, our target audiences under SPEARS previously, we look at ways to educate, ways to engage, and ways to outreach. One of the, to be broad again, and going back to the spectrum professional environment, we need technicians. We need the technical. We need those who know how to code. Maybe they're computer scientists. They need to do the MATLAB. They need to do the calculus in programming to develop the compatibility softwares. But beyond that, there's the regulatory, the policy, and financial. With the auctions going on and the spectrum relocation funds, you need to know how to budget a checkbook, so and get those numbers over to you. So with that, under the spectrum professional environment or moniker, there's opportunities to also learn. You have to also learn different types of things that you don't know. That they learn, these individuals have their skill disciplines that they learn, but we're also identifying, what I like to call, the power skills. Others call it soft skills, but, power skills. We need to identify, negotiation and diplomacy type skills, getting to yes, especially in those international meetings, right? And then crucial conversations, just to name a few. As an engineer myself, coming up through this area, and I go to a domestic regulatory or go to an international meeting, previously, I'm not aware of these tools that are available. So we need to identify these tools and ensure that the Spectrum professional community have access to these tools and training modules as well.
So I think this kind of goes into the last strategic pillar, right, of Pillar 4, which is improving policymakers' understanding of Spectrum. I'm a policymaker myself who's worked on Spectrum and Capitol Hill for many years. I appreciate how complex it is to try to understand these issues and grapple, I think, with some of these technical questions. But I think we're here before a bunch of policymakers. I think what message would you give folks to help them better understand this critical resource? And I think the opportunity it presents, because I think increasingly we're seeing, and the strategy is a great example, that policymakers really are given like a lot of choices, and sometimes people feel like it's a zero-sum game. Some people feel like it's an either-or. And I think for you all who here on the panel where you've worked and innovated and created new solutions, sometimes it's not so black and white. Sometimes there's new solutions that people haven't thought about. And I'd be curious, like just starting with Phil at the end, sort of what you would say to policymakers here about that.
Oh, the first thing I'd say, look, this is not a zero-sum game. There are often ways to cooperate. We heard this from the Qualcomm gentleman this morning. I guess it's not a coincidence because he's been saying this since I was there. But very often technology can solve the problem. Not always, but very often, if you've got A and B, you're competing over one piece of spectrum, sometimes, going to a different technology, doing things differently, can let them both operate. So I know when it comes to a policymaker, especially one who does not have really deep, strong technical background, they may not realize that it does not have to be a competition. Well, it's always going to be a competition, but there's often a way to give each side most of what they want. That's probably the most important thing when it comes to spectrum allocations. And I've seen these battles, from one side, actually from two areas, through my job and through amateur radio for a long time. And very often these things turn into headbutting contests. They don't have to.
I totally agree with that. Nick?
Okay.
I thought Phil was going to suggest that everyone should get a ham radio license.
Yeah, I was going to sell my Ericsson stock if you did.
I guess my key message for policymakers would be ask more of academia. I think there's a growing collection of faculty who see this. Higher education is in a bit of a difficult spot these days, depending upon how you look at things. Spectrum is an area where academics with some know-how, either in physics or electrical engineering or computer science, political science, economics, they can contribute to the conversation. They can help distill some of the complexity. And it turns out that there's a collaboration going on between NSF, NTIA, and FCC to ensure that this thing called the Spectrum Innovation Initiative at NSF is successful. There's this thing called the National Spectrum Strategy that we get to work together collaboratively to try to structure these kinds. Ask more of academia. Give me a call. I'll put you in touch with someone who might have the expertise you're looking for.
Which is why we did a listening session at SpectrumX while we were developing the Spectrum strategy. I'll make a plug for you. Cheryl?
So this is hard because now I'm in a public company, but when I was at NTIA, it was really pretty interesting because we did have the occasions to be called in and talk to different committee members, and that was really illuminating because after a while I would get calls as the quasi-CTO for NTIA, running ITS, I would get calls about things like chips and quantum because I used to run a quantum development for Honeywell, and it was really great. I mean, because they reached out and had a resource that they trusted as part of NTIA. But as a commercial person, I tried to speak truth. I try to give NTIA and FCC the best of our engineers and the best of our modelers whenever I can, and try to participate in the PAS initiative with DoD and NTIA. So it's really hard as a commercial company, because I think we're looked at as a commercial company, with some suspect. Are you trying to sell something? What are you trying to give us? Whereas I come at it, I really personally always come at it from like the purity of the science and the purity of the engineering. So it's a difficult question for me.
It's fair. RJ?
All right, well, thank you. So one of the other things that we've been doing, apart from Spears was more reaching into what we do at NASA to develop our Spectrum workforce. One of the things we initiated back in 2021 was also what we call the Spectrum Workforce Development Forum. And that was a cross-agency, cross-departmental effort to engage and take a look at what different organizations are doing, leverage on those so there's least amount of duplication of effort, better investment, and better efficiency of taxpayers' monies, and then moving together collaboratively. It was done informally, but we had such good partnerships in that. Everyone's interested, everyone knows and recognizes these challenges, and they make their own free time, even though they have, their plates are already full. They came up and joined that Spectrum Workforce Development. We have the opportunity now. It's epitomized and it's here in the National Spectrum Strategy. And I really want to thank Coop and NTIA and your leadership for recognizing that this is a critical challenge, putting into the strategy. There's no excuses going back, but my one request to other policymakers out there, please provide the advocacy. Please provide the critical investments in order for us to engage and create the activities to make Pillar 4 a success for the National Spectrum Strategy that will help invest into this current spectrum workforce and also the next generation of spectrum professionals.
Yeah, and I would just say, like, RJ was a real driving force behind this pillar, so we definitely appreciate your leadership here. So I think just to close out, I'd just like to give each of the panelists an opportunity to offer any final thoughts they have here. RJ, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, we've been going at the NASA Spears for 5 years now. The Spectrum Workforce Development for going on 3 years. There's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of things. Again, as we worked with Spectrum X. We worked with a couple of folks from NSF as well. They tried to do a brain mapping exercise of what spectrum professionals is, and the gentleman got down. I think he'd spent about 3 months working on this. Got down to a point where a big whiteboard was already full, and he had barely scratched the surface of 10% of what spectrum professional is. So yes, I just want to there's so much here. It's a lot to unpack. Many challenges, but through the leaders that we have up here today, the leaders that we have out there and online, we need to start collaborating, working together, and start chopping and niching away at all these different challenges. And hopefully, someone at NTIA that's developing the plan, executing the plan, will be able to make sense out of all of this and make headway, identify the activities that are impactful, they're implementable, and they're very actionable. So,
thank you. For me, I think I would like to see everyone in the audience try to mentor one person, whether you're an attorney, whether you're a policymaker or an engineer. Mentor one person and get one person excited about it, because there's possibilities in spectrum, there's possibilities in STEM. Our future, our nation's future, really relies on our ability to stay at the forefront of technology and innovation. And quite frankly, some of the speakers this morning were talking about that. Dr. Prabhakar was talking about that for sure. And I know Dr. Ponch really believes in that over at NSF. So I would like to say that, every one of us has a role to play in our workforce development. Every one of us has a way to get someone excited about Spectrum, about engineering, about technician work, or about other adjunct professional careers that RJ was talking about. And, I'm the one who laughed at the megahertz, joke this morning, okay? So I don't know what that says about me, but at the same time, really reach out to me, reach out to Dr. Ghosh, reach out to Mary Shergat at DARPA, because we're here to really support also, underrepresented people, women especially, in these fields. I know for my daughter's sake, it's hard being in a class with a bunch of guys, right? And it's hard being in the robotics club when there's a bunch of guys who mostly resemble the people on The Big Bang Theory. And so please help people. I did. I'm sorry. I don't know why, Nick. I'm so sorry. But anyway, help the next generation. He just want to shut me up.
Just having fun with you, Cheryl. So she stole my line. So I just wanted to say, if you told me 15 years ago that I would be at this table, I wouldn't believe you. I became curious about Spectrum and Spectrum issues around the TV white spaces era, and I was fascinated that it wasn't just a technology problem. As kind of a maybe prideful engineer, I thought, yeah, we should be able to solve that problem. And it took years, and it didn't really pan out from a technology point of view. Of course, then there was a policy innovation, right? So I fell in love with the field, and I've gotten pulled into it more and more over time. And so I don't know, mentoring is a big ask. I was going to suggest that everyone in the room and everyone online try to identify 10 young people, roughly 6 middle school or high school kids, roughly 3 undergraduates, and maybe a graduate student or even a faculty member, and point them in the direction of the National Spectrum Strategy. Just nudge them, encourage them, maybe give them a little guidance, maybe mentor them. But if enough of us do that, we could have 1,000 scholars like that. And I think that would be a big step in the direction of raising awareness, building interest, and pointing people into this direction of a number of career opportunities that will ultimately contribute in a very meaningful way to the success of our nation. Thank you.
Okay, I'll get it up front, get a ham license, okay, that's a given, I don't say that again.
Can we take a test today?
If you like, I need 3 volunteer examiners. Okay, no, seriously, I do believe that amateur radio has a very big potential role to play here. I mean, that's why I was invited here. I don't think we're realizing anywhere near its potential. I mean, it's primarily educational, yeah, but even there, I think we could do a lot more than we are doing. We need to involve more teachers, get more clubs started. Kids today have enormous demands on their time. They have many things going on, and that is a challenge. It's bigger than when I was in high school, at least as I remember. But if you make it interesting enough for them, they'll come back. We were surprised to find that about half of the kids who come back every week to our ham club meeting are female. All you have to do is make them feel welcome. Make it interesting. They'll come back, and they'll keep coming back. Get them their ham licenses. We fly balloons, so every time a new student gets their ham license, we put her call sign on the transmitter, so when we launch it, they'll be that kind of thing. Little things like that actually matter. So, but we're looking for more ideas. We would love to have suggestions on other ways we use the amateur service to get young people involved. We're thinking about it all the time, but I'm sure there are some that we've missed. But don't also forget the potential of the ham service to contribute to direct experimentation with some of the problems you're talking about. In the amateur service, no one station owns a frequency. We sign it. We have to sign every time we renew our licenses. It says no amateur station owns a frequency. We have to share. So we've already had to deal with these problems of spectral sharing, mutual interference, and dynamic allocation for a long time. And I personally have gotten actually very interested in trying these out on the ham bands. In 1990, I came up with one of the techniques for dynamic spectrum sharing. It sounds an awful lot like what I've been hearing recently about where you get on and say, hey, I need to listen here for a certain period of time, please stay off that frequency. I did this in 1990, and I was doing it for ham radio. I had no idea that anybody would do anything like that later. It made its way into Wi-Fi. Is one of the features of Wi-Fi. So we do have potential not only for education, I think, but some small-scale experimentation, especially in the fields where apparently other people are having problems. Like I was surprised to hear about problems with communication between different groups who are sharing the spectrum. And we also, or in just going through the kinds of regulatory approvals you need to operate a new waveform. Hams have a lot of regulatory flexibility. As long as we stay within the rules, 1.5 kilowatts maximum power output, we have to stay in the band, stay in the bandwidth limits, don't intentionally interfere with anybody. We can do pretty much what we want, and that does seem to be a very big advantage of the ham service. So on a small scale, and maybe perhaps on an academic scale, we can try some of these things. And we would be delighted if some of the results were useful to the larger spectrum sharing community, because we know more than anybody that the spectrum is limited. We see, pressure on our spectrum all the time, and we want to make ourselves, we want to justify what we have.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to the panel, and thank you for sharing these insights with the folks here and online. I hope for people watching, you gain an appreciation for how important it is that we're not just addressing the spectrum pipeline, we're not just thinking about new technologies, and we're not just thinking about ways we can coordinate better. But ultimately, there's this issue of human capital, right? How can we leverage talent and interest and fun, right, to really create new opportunities, to really drive this technology forward, and ultimately for the country to continue to succeed and lead the way. And I want to thank our panelists again for all of this, and thank you all. Have a good one.
All right, thanks, Phil. That was a great panel. Appreciate all that valuable insight from the panelists, and appreciate you taking the time to do that. So if you've made it this far, you're in for a real treat. We're going to finish things off here with a very fine discussion with some very fine people. We're going to be talking about looking forward, and we've got NTIA's own Scott Harris, who you've heard from already. And just to emphasize the point, Scott was the man at NTIA behind making sure this spectrum strategy made it across the finish line. And we also have Austin Bonner, Deputy CTO for Policy in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And she was our champion and guided the effort from within the White House, from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and joining them will be Matt Pearl, who took a similar role inside the National Security Council. Matt is the Director and Special Advisor for Emerging Technologies at NSC. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Scott.
So I said this morning, this was going to be the best panel of the day, and I am convinced it's going to be the best panel of the day. And I thank you diehards who stayed to see if I was right. So I'll just start by asking questions. We spent the entire day talking about the National Spectrum Strategy and the Implementation Plan. But both of these efforts were directed by the Presidential Memorandum on Spectrum, a document which I think has gotten far less attention than it deserves. So, spectrum strategy aside, Austin, what's the most important thing in the Presidential Memorandum?
It's a good question. And first, I just want to say thank you so much to Scott, to Alan, to the team for hosting this amazing day. It has been just such an incredibly active few months in spectrum policy, from the PM to the National Spectrum Strategy, the World Radio Communication Conference in Dubai. We have a lot of good work to reflect on and a lot more to do in 2024. So we're glad to be talking to you about it. The presidential memorandum really sets out President Biden's vision for a coordinated spectrum policy that's designed to maximize the benefits the American people get from spectrum. We've said it all today, but I think it's really worth emphasizing that this is in President Biden's voice, that we're focused on enhancing the national defense to improve customer services, improve the way government works, improve scientific discovery. He's really set a course for innovation and technical leadership, and one that I think has guided our efforts. There's some key provisions, joint management, reaffirming the roles of NTIA and FCC that I think are so natural to those of you who made it through a whole day of a Spectrum Symposium. Establishing the Spectrum Advisory Council, a senior level body designed to provide advice and counsel in this area. And creating a dispute resolution mechanism led by the White House, a sort of consistent, clear place to bring challenges so that we can work to resolve them together.
Yeah, I think Austin covered the really important points. The only thing I would add is that I think one area that has probably also not gotten enough play is that there's a mechanism in the PM that ensures that before federal spectrum studies are done, that they're coordinated with NTIA and the agencies. And that's really critical, something that we discovered in some of these disputes and issues that came up in the last few years is it's really important to have discussions about what assumptions are going to be used in studies, what the methodology is, whether they're relying on good engineering. And so that's really an important mechanism for ensuring that the federal government is advancing President Biden's goals in terms of having a science-based, data-based approach to these issues.
Thanks, Matt. Following up on that question, among the things it did, the Presidential Memorandum did, was create the Interagency Spectrum Advisory Council. What role, if any, will the ISAC play in the development of the NSS Implementation Plan and beyond as the federal government executes on the plan? Matt, can I toss that to you?
Yeah, so the ISAC is the principal forum for senior agency officials to work with NTIA to make sure that their equities are incorporated into spectrum decisions. And so it's senior officials. It's chaired by Assistant Secretary Alan Davidson from NTIA. The White House is also there as well. And so that's an important body. It's actually a formalization of an informal body that would meet on and off for the past probably 10 years, the PPSG. And so that'll be a really critical body. I would note that, and to provide a bit more perspective on how this fits in with other federal government organizations on spectrum, so there are others that are very useful. One is the IRAC, and the IRAC is more of a working level organization for coordinating everyday proposed spectrum actions between FCC, NTIA, and the agencies. And so that's more working level, while the ISAC is a senior agency principals. And then I would note that a lot of this comes down to technical issues. And so in many cases, the PPSG before this and also the ISAC can create a technical subcommittee of engineers that'll really get to the bottom of issues and then report back to the ISAC. And then finally, sometimes there are issues that can't be resolved by the ISAC or by NTIA and the agencies. And that's when the White House, which includes National Security Council, National Economic Council, Office of Science and Technology Policy, where we would convene NTIA, FCC, and the agencies to discuss, reach consensus, and resolve those issues. which is how we arrived at the policy decisions in the National Spectrum Strategy. And just as we use that for the strategy, we're committed as necessary to use it for some of these important spectrum decisions that we're going to be making in the coming months and years.
Thanks, Matt. Austin, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'll just highlight what I think are a couple of important features of that organization. The presidential memorandum was the end of a long road that included a lot of conversations along the way at different levels inside many, many agencies. And one of the things that was just so consistent was the need for senior level buy-in to this very important process early and often. And kind of memorializing that at the assistant secretary level is one of the things that the council is trying to do. I also just think it's really important that we establish the consistency of the role of the council, that there is a regularly meeting place of these very senior agency officials who know each other, who know the issues, and when something urgent arises, something really important arises, we all know where it'll go, and we'll be ready to work together. The last thing I'll say is the level of expertise in that organization, it really is just so astonishing. At a meeting that we had a few weeks ago, I looked around the Zoom at the kind of people who were there, and the wide variety of PhDs and senior level degrees and various life experiences, I think really represents the breadth of spectrum users in this country and across the federal agencies. I hope it won't embarrass him to say that one of the best things about being in Dubai for WRC was getting to hang out with Dr. Michael Morgan a bunch during the time, who's the assistant secretary at NOAA, a PhD meteorologist, incredible person, and having that kind of expertise available to us in spectrum policy making, I think really is one of the great things about what we've set up.
Thank you. Look, all of us who do spectrum regularly know that presidents don't usually focus on spectrum, right? Yet in this White House, OSTP, the NSC, the NEC have all been involved, deeply involved in spectrum policy. I mean, the Deputy National Security Advisor gave a keynote this morning, and your boss, the director of OSTP, gave a keynote this afternoon. I mean this in a good way, but this isn't normal. So why has this White House been so interested in spectrum policy, and what roles do you and your offices play in spectrum policy, and maybe more importantly, do you want to talk about what roles you see for your offices going forward? Austin, you want to do that one?
I think the partnership between OSTP, the National Economic Council, and the National Security Council has just been incredibly important in getting this policy right. From the very beginning of the administration, all three of those organizations strongly agreed that spectrum policy needed to change and that it needed presidential level direction. There are lots of good reasons for that. I think the main one is that this is a feature of virtually every aspect of American life, all of the issues that you've seen raised today, and that means it needs guidance from somebody at the presidential level who has an oversight of the entire federal enterprise, the entire economy. For us at OSTP, this is really close to home. Our organization is charged with making sure that the president gets the very best science and technology advice, and with sort of developing science and technology policy that leads the world. I say a lot, one of my favorite things about working at OSTP is that I work with a bunch of scientists who get things like rain fade immediately. It's an especially, I think, exciting part for OSTP. The National Spectrum Strategy charges our organization with making sure we get research and development done well. We are really lucky to be supported by the Networking and Information Technology and Research Development, the NITRD organization. We've got folks here today who are going to be working on a research and development strategy that I know we're all really excited about getting started. That's the kind of activity that's really at the heart of OSTP's work, and we're excited to be involved in.
So I would, of course, echo what Austin said about the strong partnership between the EOP components. We talk at least half a dozen times a day, and sometimes more, just to be on the same page, share information, make sure that we're getting our principals the right information and making the right decisions. I can't do a better job at articulating the NSC's views on this than my boss did this morning, Deputy National Security Advisor Newberger. But as she explained, we're really committed to leveraging this resource for our national security, and have a full understanding that that requires both having the military and our intelligence communities have access to spectrum, as well as having the commercial sector be able to innovate, which is really the key to out-competing and out-innovating the PRC in the long term. And so the areas that we're most focused on, along with OSTP and NEC, are the in-depth band studies. Those are going to be really critical, as well as the dynamic spectrum sharing effort, just given that DoD and other national security agencies are such heavy spectrum users. We really want to leverage technology in order to innovate our way out of this. And then in terms of our role, I would just also mention that the NSC has an important role in terms of having a really robust interagency process under NSM2, the memorandum for renewing the National Security Council system. And so we convene the interagency, reach consensus and conclusions. It's co-chaired with OSTP and NEC, our partners in this. But that's another important part of the work that we do on these issues.
Thanks, Matt. So with the presidential memorandum and the national spectrum strategy in place, the implementation plan is 6 weeks from being released. Do you think we've turned a corner in heading off some of the allocation compatibility disputes of recent years? Because it's been sort of a show recently. Are we getting by that? Do we have we made progress yet?
Yeah, we have, and I think as some of the people in the room know, I was at the FCC before I came to the NSC, managing a lot of the spectrum transitions, like C-band, that were very challenging. And I experienced,
yeah, that's a word for it.
I experienced all of the problems and tried to work with everyone to solve it, and I really think that we have. So the FCC and NTIA have made significant progress, not only adopting a new MOU and updating it, but actually operationalizing it for proposed spectrum decisions. And then it really goes back to, fundamentally, that commitment from President Biden that the White House is going to, as necessary, escalate and resolve any issues, disagreements, and disputes as early in the process as we can, using the interagency process that I talked about. And we already, the strategy is the fruits of those efforts. And so I expect the same process to be successful with the spectrum decisions, some of which are going to be very difficult and very challenging, and there are going to be disagreements. But we're absolutely committed to making sure that the government takes private sector input and then takes agency equities and resolves those disputes and makes decisions in a timely manner, in a whole of government manner.
Thank you, Matt. Austin, you want to weigh in on that one? Have we turned a corner?
I think we've turned a corner, but we also have set ourselves a challenging road, right? Like it's not like we set the national spectrum strategy doesn't mean that there are many low stakes decisions. Like we're going to have to decide hard things on a tight schedule over and over again as we implement the national spectrum strategy. What makes me optimistic and excited to do that work is that we've really set a process in place to be able to handle that, and brought together a group of smart and talented and really dedicated people who don't always agree with each other, but who are in this together for the long run. And I think that is starting to work. I mean, Matt mentioned the C-band. The full C-band's been available for use since July. That's the result of an intensive collaboration. That's the government and the private sector working together to come to a technical solution. And they came a long way. Matt had an experience along that way. But I think that trustworthy, predictable process where people know how we're going to handle it when we don't always agree is a big part of the path forward.
Thanks. So in developing the National Spectrum Strategy and now working on the implementation plan, we took great pains, as you know, to seek private sector input. And we got a lot of private sector input, as everyone in this room knows. And that was because the private sector is vitally concerned and has a great deal at stake in nearly all aspects of the National Spectrum Strategy and in its implementation. What can we do to make sure the private sector remains heard and is involved in the process going forward, right? The implementation plan is going to be issued pursuant to the President's memorandum on March 14th, if I've done my 120 days correctly. How are they going to be involved after that? And maybe that's part of a broader question. How do we sustain the momentum I think we've actually created, both across the government and with the private sector over the next few years as the plan is actually implemented?
So first of all, I would really applaud both Scott and Assistant Secretary Davidson. I think historically the FCC has had a very transparent public process for receiving input, and NTIA less so, and you both have been committed to having NTIA be as transparent and really receiving comments, public listening sessions, just really creating a process for getting that input. And so obviously that's going to be critical. It's also been very helpful, and we certainly welcome, we do sometimes have meetings at the White House, particularly from groups that represent a broad range of stakeholders. And that can be really helpful, public interest groups, trade associations, coalitions, to get a really a good sense of the issues on which there's consensus and there isn't. In terms of maintaining the momentum, I think we need to stay focused on the practical challenges that stakeholders care about in the strategy, the details of the study, the details of what we're going to accomplish with the dynamic spectrum sharing effort. Obviously there's information we can't share, but whenever we can, providing some information, enough certainly that people can provide specific concrete input that then we can feed into the process in order to make our decision making better.
I was lucky that Alan and Scott let me sort of be along for the ride with a couple of the listening sessions. And it really struck me how broad and deep the private sector engagement really was. People showed up and gave remarks and gave of their time. Scott, I think we really have to hand it to you, volunteered to take any meeting anyone wanted for many, many weeks after that. And I think that you all took him up on that offer. We can't do it without you. I think we really have to have that engagement. I know folks are going to be very involved in the band studies as those go forward. My hope is that we'll see that same level of engagement in some of the longer term parts of the National Spectrum Strategy. We have set out some long-term goals that includes things like developing the workforce, where I think we have a lot to teach each other from the government side and the private sector side about how we build that workforce for the future. Scott, there were like 5 parts of your question. What else were we supposed to answer?
The key was, how do we keep the private sector engaged? What do we need to do post-implementation plan to make sure the private sector input is forthcoming and the energy that we get from that continues?
Well, maybe we'll have to ask these guys over coffee after this event.
Well, actually, maybe we don't have to wait till coffee, because I've run out of questions, actually, because you guys were quicker to respond than I anticipated. Can we have anyone in the audience have questions? I can't see with the lights, so if someone can.
The lights really are pretty bright. You're probably going to have to say your names. I'm sorry.
Okay. Does anyone have a microphone? Or yeah, there we go.
Hi, thank you. Sandra Wright from the Federal Aviation Administration. I had some questions about the long term, which you touched on, Austin. So 2 things that came to my mind is everyone's looking at this initial band study. All the work that we need to do in 2 years. There's a lot to do in 2 years. 2 years probably isn't enough time to create analysis tools and models that we can use across government and industry. And my question is kind of two parts. One is there a plan for some larger investment in some analysis tools that we can have common, repeatable, analysis that we can share data between government and industry, and it's not everyone has their proprietary tool and their different data set with their different assumptions. That's one part. I won't do 5 like Scott. My second part is the strategy tees up this first set of band studies. What's next? So 2 years from now, or 1 year from now, are we going to start talking what the next pipeline looks like and start identifying those bands? Are we going to see an update to the strategy with, addendum for the second, or can you comment on that longer term planning?
Sure. First, I'll say when you go to work at the White House, OMB implants a chip in your brain that questions about investment or questions about the future federal budget that we ought to direct to them. So I won't use the word investment, and instead I will just say that it is a huge priority and one that really animated the National Spectrum Strategy to look at not just getting those first set of band studies done, but it actually how we do that kind of work in the future to address things like the issue Matt raised, that we really need a playbook of tools that we agree on, that we can use in a consistent and repeatable manner. A thing that was always a challenge for me when I worked at the FCC was you would get studies that would come in from all over the place, and they would sort of talk past each other in ways that were hard to piece together the record into decision making. And I think building that playbook is something that's a priority for NTIA going forward.
I would just like to say, in the first part of your question, it sounded as if you were quoting from Pillar 3 of the National Spectrum Strategy, where we talked about building those kind of agreed upon models. Because going forward, to have an intelligent discussion, you need to have the same language. And part of the problem that we've all had, everyone in this room, everyone who works this issue, is that people talk in different languages about the same problem, and it makes it very hard. And yes, so the answer is we are going to focus on trying to create those kind of tools between the private sector and the public sector so that we can have an intelligent conversation. Matt, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, not at all. I'd mention a couple things. I think one thing, the studies are going to be really critical in 2 years, but these spectrum transitions have a lot of different components in terms of transition plans, coordination, and so on. And so there are these other elements that are going to have to occur, some of which can occur in parallel or after the studies have started, and some of which would occur after the studies have reached conclusions. And I would also plug, I think Scott's right about that pillar. I'd also say that one of the really critical areas for sharing some of the information you're talking about is actually the parallel effort we're going to be doing on dynamic spectrum sharing. Because I think, updating propagation models, understanding receiver performance, I think a lot of those issues are really going to be relevant to the dynamic spectrum sharing effort. And so that'll be really important and provide an opportunity to exchange that information in a more formal way. Although I will also say, and of course you're from the FAA and you know this, that I think having those formal systems will be very helpful. But one of the lessons of the C-band experience was that there also is no substitute for just having engineers talk to each other on a regular basis. Just having engineers, on that issue have calls sometimes like 2 or 3 times a day is what actually solved it. So that'll be important as well.
I just want to say, Matt, that I'm very excited about the work people are doing on updating propagation models based on a world of data that we have now that we didn't have in 1967. And if your company or organization is working on this, will you please come tell me about it? I really want to hear more. I've bugged the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences staff enough.
Other questions? Other jokes? Well, all right. If no other questions, I'm going to give you the rest of your afternoon back. I would like to thank all of you for coming and spending your time with us today. It meant a lot to us. We learned a lot from our panelists. And those of you on live stream, thank you also for hanging in there with us. And I hope you guys will continue to work with us as we plow through getting the implementation plan out and then actually implementing the strategy. Thank you all.